And I usually don't say anything at the start of these compilations, but hear me out for the next 15 seconds. Most of you aren't getting my notifications anymore. Can you please check if you're still subbed? YouTube has been turning it off for a bunch of people, so you might want to check that. Alright then, back to the spooks. Have a good night.
Let me preface this story by saying why I was traveling alone. One of my best friends, Kayla, and I worked seasonally at a hiking lodge in British Columbia for the summer. We are both girls in our early 20s. She lives and goes to school in New Brunswick, and I live and work as a chef in Toronto for the winter. We decided this year, as I bought a car, instead of flying back home, we would do an epic Canadian coast-to-coast road trip. Everything was going wonderfully. So wonderfully, in fact, we ended up staying longer in a few unexpected places and had to cut our East Coast portion of the trip short. Now, my friend Kayla started her schooling on November 1st, so I dropped her home in Moncton, New Brunswick on Halloween and stayed the night at her place, planning to head back to Toronto the next day. After a few glasses of Chardonnay and some laughs, I decided I couldn't come this close to the East Coast and not see the Cabot Trail in Nova Scotia, something that has been on my bucket list for years. So knowing I still had a week or more's vacation before my winter contract, I hastily booked a hostel for the next day, at Acolyte Hostel on the Cabot Trail. When I booked, only one option came up, I assume because I waited until the last minute to book. A private dorm with a queen-size bed for $35. Instantly, I thought it was a bargain, and booked straight away. I left Kayla's house in Moncton at 7 a.m., knowing I had a long drive ahead of me. The Cabot Trail is roughly 150 kilometers long, so I thought, to be safe, I'd plug the hostel address into my Google Maps and head straight there to get my bearings. I would arrive at the hostel for roughly noon, knowing it was too early to check in. I figured I'd consult with the front desk to figure out if they had any nearby hiking trails and take my bags in later. I was about to arrive to my hostel according to Google, but all around me was nothing but farmland. Google then instructed me that my destination was on my left. I saw nothing. About 50 yards up the road, I saw a wire bar bent to look like a letter A, spray-painted bright red. I was staying at the Acolyte Hostel, so I guess that must be the place. I followed the dirt road. It led me to what I can only describe as a dilapidated barn, no signage, and there were 2 cars parked in front. So I parked alongside and got out of my car, as I tried to figure out where I was. Once I exit my vehicle, a smallish man in his mid-40s with dark hair and intense eyes popped out of the barn and asked me if I was staying with them tonight. I said that I was, and he asked why I booked so last minute, and I explained my situation and he seemed satisfied with my answer. He insisted on taking me on the grand tour of the barn. The first thing I noticed was the entirety of the barn had been dug out of its foundation about 5 feet deep and 3 feet around. He led me across some particle board laid down as a sort of ramp leading inside. The second thing I noticed about the property was that there were no windows. It was clearly a barn meant for livestock. The gentleman leading me on this tour was named Kevin, the owner. He proceeded to tell me about his grand plans for the space. It all seemed pretty far-fetched, as it was a big old barn with particle boards separating most of the rooms. He led me up the skeleton stairs made of plywood and 2x4s to the cabin loft, where I would be sleeping that night, along with his family, the mother of his 5-year-old son, his son and Kevin's own mother, who insisted I call her Mum. The upstairs was certainly open concept. A frail curtain separated the beds to the sides with a large open area in the middle. I asked if I was the only occupant that night, and he said yes. I had a feeling he didn't often get occupants. I told him I was interested in the hikes in the area, and wanted to get to them before it got dark. He gave me very detailed instructions of his favorite hikes and how to get to them, and off I went. I figured the place wasn't ideal, and I wish the website would have let me know it was still being built. But hey, I booked last minute and beggars can't be choosers. Plus, he was very friendly and helpful on my hiking advice. I hiked the area until it started getting dark. I didn't pack enough food for the day, but I figured I'd head into town for dinner. The nearest town was clearly a banging tourist destination during the summer, but now was the off-season, and it was a ghost town. All the hotels and B&Bs in the area were boarded up, such a ghost town that even the liquor store was closed for the off-season. Finally, I found a dark, dingy, empty bar to eat dinner. It was, to phrase it lightly, a disappointing supper. I had this romantic image in my head of me sitting on the harbour front sipping on bubbly, slurping back some fresh ocean oysters. I was assured by the server/bartender/cook that the oysters I had ordered were definitely not fresh, and I decided to not ask further. I figure, with all my options for things to see and do exhausted, I should just head back to the hostel and read my book. I got back for roughly 8 p.m, and I could smell the family that lived there were in the midst of cooking dinner. A little boy ran down the stairs and greeted me. He yelled, as little boys always do, "My name's JP, what's yours?" "Nice to meet you, JP, I'm Alex." He immediately asked if I wanted to come and play. I said definitely, and asked to just give him a moment to put my bags down. He followed me through the translucent curtains to my room, so instead of getting settled in, I headed straight out into the main area and started throwing a foam ball around with JP. His mother and father, Kevin, and grandmother, Mum, were all sitting down there to eat without even acknowledging we were playing in front of them. The mother and father start what seemed to be a basic argument, which turns into them yelling at each other. Completely weirded out, I told JP I needed to return to my room to call my mummy as she was wondering where I was. Of course, the boy who doesn't understand proper boundaries yet follows me through the curtains and sits on my bed. I tried taking his attention away from his family fight, so I asked him where he was going to school and his favorite colors and stuff. His mother starts calling for him, and he doesn't answer. Instead, he chooses to sit on my lap and hug me. Not wanting to cause any problems, I yell to the mother that he's in my room. She runs and snatches him off my lap, and yells to the father, "I know what you're like when you get angry. I'm taking JP. Don't follow us." I hear her booking it down the stairs and him running after her. I hear a car start up in the lot, and not just drive but peel out of the driveway. I hear him cursing, slamming doors, and the sound of the excavator which I had seen outside earlier that day come on. I guess he wanted to do some handiwork to let off some steam. Now, just left upstairs is me and Grandma, who insisted I still call her Mum. I walked out of my not-so-private curtained room with my bag and say, "Listen, you guys are great hosts, but I should be going." She starts rubbing my arm and telling me to stay, explaining her daughter-in-law doesn't understand Kevin like she does, and that she is the real problem. Now I'm fully ready to tell Mum to just piss off right then and there, until I realize she still has a knife in her hand from cooking dinner. It's only a 4-inch paring knife, but with intent. I'm sure it would do some damage. I don't think she meant it as a threat. I think she was just a kooky old bird who didn't understand. Maybe don't hold the knife while trying to console a stranger. So I go along with what she's saying until she rubs my arm with one hand and flays the knife around with the other. I inch closer and closer downstairs towards the door. She keeps rubbing my arm and shoulder with her free hand, telling me to stay and that her grandson is special. And before I even booked the night, he had a premonition that I would be staying with them. As soon as I get out the door, I run towards my car. I start my engine and back up the lot to get out of there. Kevin in the excavator blocks the path, with about a 5-foot ditch on one side of the drive and the forest behind me. He gets out, says he's sorry, and tells me I should stay and that he'll make it up to me. Grandma comes out, knife still in hand, saying it's Kevin's fault I'm leaving. They bicker for 5 minutes until I yell if they don't let me leave, I'd call the police. All of a sudden they get super defensive, like I'm the one being unreasonable, so I turn off my engine and start to dial. Kevin gets back in his excavator and starts backing up. As soon as he's far enough away, I can see the opening to drive across the grass. I turn my engine back on and rip out of the drive. I'm sure I'm doing a number on the suspension of my little sedan. As soon as the property is out of sight, I go to call my friend Kayla. No service. I remember back to earlier in the afternoon when I first got to the hostel. I was going to check my messages and saw the no service sign. Even if I'd have wanted to call the cops, I wouldn't have been able to. I drove the 6 hours straight to Moncton, New Brunswick, and stayed with Kayla again. The site I used to book was Hostel World. Once I got back to Toronto, I couldn't even find them online anymore. I did, however, receive an email from Kevin explaining he was sorry and not to leave a negative review. They're not on any sites, Yelp, TripAdvisor, etc., so I couldn't even leave them a review if I wanted to. Funnily enough, they're still on Booking.com and have really good reviews. I think it might be cool when there are other people there too. In any case, I would never return and not recommend it to anyone, and I'm fairly certain I dodged several bullets that night.
My name is Lily. At the time of writing this, I'm a 20-year-old woman who lives with my boyfriend, Ben, and our 3 cats. We live in a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment on the 3rd floor, right next to the outside stairs, and can very easily hear anyone walking up or entering the apartments around us. Our room is right beside the front door, and the window looks out onto the wooden stairs/deck area. A little background/context. A little less than a year ago, I had a stalker. I met him on a popular BDSM site and made it very clear to him from the beginning that I wasn't interested in anything serious, strictly a friends with benefits type of relationship. He was a little odd, and admitted to me he had autism, but I didn't care. I had plenty of friends growing up, and currently who were on the spectrum, and were still functioning members of society, as most are. I hung out with him frequently because of the sex, but also because I was 19 and he would buy me booze with my money. I worked 2 jobs during this time, 1 retail and 1 food service. People at my retail job knew him and suggested very heavily to me prior that he wasn't a great person and to be careful. I started distancing myself from him when he began talking about his severe mental illness, specifically his predisposition to schizophrenia. I told him he needed to seek medical attention if he thought something was wrong and tried supporting him. I tried backing away completely when he admitted to me he had dreams of murdering me and my parents' dog, murdering him and having flashbacks to Auschwitz where he killed children in a past life. Lovely. I immediately cut contact with him, but made sure to record calls and voicemails. When telling my retail co-workers about this, they told me that the behavior was not new. Ben and I had just begun seeing each other at this point, but he, as well as my parents, strongly encouraged that I file the restraining order. I told them that I would think it over, but it was solidified when he showed up to my place of work just to get food. I hid in the back of the restaurant and told my shift leader I couldn't go out there until he was gone. I could tell he was skeptical, but I said it was fine as long as I stayed busy in the back. I called Ben while back there to inform him of what was going on, and after heading up, resumed my job. Ben showed up minutes after and made it very clear to my stalker that I didn't want to see him, but did not threaten him. My shift leader later told me that while making my stalker's meal, he looked 2 co-workers in the eyes and said, "I know Lily is in the back hiding from me." My uncle is a retired lawyer, and therefore helped me take proper action against him. My stalker's lawyer and my uncle worked together frequently before my uncle retired, and struck a deal with my attorney and uncle that if we dropped the charges, he would put the fear of God in him. After all of this, I have yet to see him again 6 months later. Ben and I are both night owls, and also pretty antisocial. It was around 11:30 p.m, and Ben and I were chatting quietly with the lights off in our room. There was a natural lull in our conversation when we were both on our phones, and there was suddenly a knock at the door to the tune of a shave and a haircut. We both froze instantly and stayed silent. There were a few more seconds of silence, then the knock repeated. This pattern continued for about 5 minutes before I started freaking out silently to Ben beside me. We were both stark nude and were expecting no one. Ben and I quietly walked out the room and to the door, looking out the peephole, and saw no one. We were still freaking out and walked to the kitchen and both grabbed steak knives to give ourselves some semblance of a safe feeling. When attempting to go back to our room, the knock happened again twice more, and Ben ordered me to get in the bedroom and hid just out of sight in case something got ugly and needed to surprise attack whoever this was. He looked out the peephole again, and before I could ask him if he saw anyone, he flung the door open and walked onto the balcony, still naked. I hissed at him to get back inside, and he did just that before locking the door again. He said no one was there, and proceeded to lock us and the cats in the room for the night. We really hope it was a case of someone having the wrong apartment. When telling my parents, they were pissed that I hadn't called the police, saying it very well could have been an attempt of burglary of what little valuables we own. Small side note, my 9-year-old sister lives with our grandmother in the same complex and building, but a different apartment. I pushed and asked if she had attempted pranking us, ready to tear her a new one about how she could have been hurt. She very heavily insisted she didn't, because she had to be up early the next day for a summer camp trip. Whoever knocked on our door at nearly midnight, for all of our safety, let's not meet again. My hobby is mountain hiking. The kind of mountains I like to hike are ones with no roads, no other people, and where wild vegetables grow, off the beaten track. Sometimes on these hikes I come across strange or unusual things. For example, I once saw an albino antelope, and on another occasion saw an eagle the size of a grown man. However, the weirdest incident was the time I came across a family impossibly far into the mountains. It was a weekend afternoon, and I was hiking along the prefectural border between Miyagi, Yamanaga, and Akita. There was a forest full of huge beech trees which made it quite easy to walk as it got dark. This is a place that not an everyday person would hike. Only local people to this mountain range would probably know about it, or people like me who enjoy hiking and have GPS. It was secluded. As I was walking along a small ridge, I noticed a small stream flowing below. At the edge of the stream, I saw a man standing there. I first thought, he must be doing a spot of fishing, but then I noticed that he wasn't alone. 4 other people stood with him. They were all standing in the river. I couldn't see clearly because I must have been about 100 meters away, but I was sure that there were 4 people standing there. 2 appeared to be children. I didn't know why, but I thought they might be on the verge of committing a family suicide. I mean, to come all the way out here to this secluded mountain river alone, so close to dark. If that was the case, I planned to intervene and talk them out of it. I hoped that wouldn't be the case, but either way, I was interested in finding out what was going on, so I used my binoculars to take a closer look. Just as I thought, 4 people facing away from me, 2 children and 2 adults. I watched for a moment, waiting for them to turn my way so I could catch a glimpse of their faces, but they didn't move at all. I must have been watching them for 5 minutes, and yet they didn't move. Then it dawned on me. They're mannequins. Someone must have put them here as a prank or as a trap. I decided to go in for a closer look, since my first thought was to check on the family anyway. I quietly crept closer and didn't want to be noticed. In my mind, I was planning my escape route. Jumping in the river itself crossed my mind if something terrible were to occur. As I drew closer, my predictions came true. There were 4 mannequins before me, 2 adults and 2 children, all dressed up out here in the middle of nowhere. I was disgusted. My body shivered. I couldn't think logically why they would be here. I thought to myself, whoever did this must not be right in the head. I was now close enough to see the details on the mannequin. Each one had a name printed on its front. Each mannequin was peppered with small holes like bullet holes, like a shotgun bullet trail. The piece de resistance was a broken box cutter blade sticking out of one of the child mannequins' backs. That was enough for me. I was terrified and began to make it back down the mountain, and even as I write this now, I'm shivering. Those creepy mannequin dolls with marks up and down them. Someone carried them all over there to do whatever they did to them, but why? These were not light mannequins either. They were bulky, heavy wooden ones. If I had to carry them myself, I would have to have stopped for a while to take a rest, but there were 4 of them. Must have taken forever to get there. This all happened 2 years ago. I guess they're still there. I was working at a random shop as a part-time worker during the night shift. Mainly cleaning because there weren't that many customers at night. All the guys at the store would always, day or night, go outside instead of going to the men's toilet, and I never knew why. There was a sign on the men's bathroom that said, "Keep out," spelled with a C. I thought it was a typo. One of the workers who worked 1 hour of night shift told me that it was supposed to say "creep out," and it was hung by a customer. I wonder why. So when he left the store, I went to the bathroom. It smelled like someone had died in there, literally. There was a fresh cheeseburger on the floor and a 2-day-old drink. I was confused, but I heard someone enter the store, so I sold them what they needed and went back. The door was closed, even though I left it open. I went in, and the cheeseburger had 2 bites in it, and the drink was spilled everywhere. There was no one in the stores or anything. I left the place and left a sign on the door for the morning shift, and I wrote this: "I closed early because I was afraid. There's something in the men's bathroom. Bring it a new drink if you don't believe me." I worked the morning shift after that and told them everything. We put up cameras and did everything we could, but there was no sign of anyone. They believed me, but we didn't know what was happening. I told the owner of the shop, and she said this: "Josh, darling, we haven't had the men's bathroom for 12 years now. That's why everyone goes outside. The place for the men's bathroom is a place for leftover food. Are you okay?" I was confused, and me and the morning shift guy went to check. The owner was correct, but who ate the burger if there's no other entrance to the place for leftovers? And the usually locked door. I stopped working there, but was kept informed of the situation. The rest of the information was handed to me from Ben. He said that there was someone or something in the vents of the so-called men's bathroom, but he never did tell me if there was anything after that. I went to the place way later, and it was in ruins. Only 2 dogs, dead, crushed by the bricks. I never heard from anyone else there again. I turned 21 before my friends did, so naturally being an alcoholic, I went to bars alone. I was waiting in line one night, and an attractive woman who had clearly had too much to drink came up to me and started rubbing on my chest. I was a single man, so if an attractive woman wants to rub me, I was fine with that. She said how attractive I was, and then started saying how much she missed me. We were strangers. She started then sobbing uncontrollably. By the time her friends had caught up with her and saw her crying, just before she turned and ran away from me, one of her friends chased after her, and the other walked up to me and said, "Sorry about that. Her boyfriend just died 2 weeks ago in a motorcycle accident." She was looking at me kind of funny, but that whole situation was kind of funny, and I said, No problem, and that I was sorry for her loss. She went on to say, "It's weird, can I tell you something? You look exactly like her boyfriend did, like exactly like him. We saw you as soon as she did. We froze and didn't know exactly what to do when she ran up to you. We briefly exchanged pleasantries, and I went inside for a stiff drink. 3 months later, I was hit in a horrific motorcycle crash and nearly died, suffering the almost same fate as her boyfriend. This happened to me when I was around middle school age. I can't remember the year, but I was quite young and was staying the weekend at my grandmother's house with my dad, as it was his weekend to see me. My parents are divorced, so I would travel to South Carolina to see my dad every other weekend at that time. That day, she had decided to take us to see her sister, my great aunt, who lived alone on an old plantation that she rented out for large wedding venues. The land is a sprawling plain, with the main house at the top, a barn several dozen feet beside it, and an outside bathroom that looks more like a mini home with a porch. There are walking paths between these and are relatively close. It was my first time coming to the property, and I was excited to explore. My aunt showed me around the large old house, explaining that there were guest rooms for the bride and rooms for her family and the groom's family to get ready for their wedding. She eventually mentioned that because the house was so old, there was a ghost living on the property. She had asked a medium to do a reading of her home once, and revealed that there was a young man named Isaac who was a slave on the property hundreds of years before. He had been working late at night, without a candle or lantern, and had fallen into the well and died. While showing me the outside grounds, among showing me the barn and the bathroom, she showed me the crude flat stone marker on the edge of the woods of her property, where he was allegedly buried according to the medium. They had simply covered the well with dirt and placed the stone over it. There are no records proving this to be the case that my aunt could find, but the activity she had experienced in the home begs the difference. At this point, the adults were all inside the house talking and drinking coffee. I decided to wander and explore as I planned. I pet the horses on the edge of the fence and ran into the yard and decided to take a bathroom break in the outside bathhouse. Both the men's and women's restrooms were spacious, containing a shower, a large sink, and a toilet. So I sat and was ready to get back up and go outside when all of a sudden, without warning, 5 loud bangs rang against the door. It scared me so bad. Before the last bang, I had already begun to shout, "I'm almost done, I'm getting out now." And in one quick motion, I stood up, pulled my pants up and yanked open the bathroom door to find no one was there. I looked across the field at the men's restroom and didn't hear someone go in there. But it made sense if someone really needed to use the restroom that badly, they would have gone there instead. But I didn't hear a door slam, as I had ran to the door so quickly, with less than a 5-second interval, that if they had tried to make a break for it, I would have heard, as you would have had to stomp on the porch and slam the door closed behind them. I called out, but no one answered. I ran down off the porch and stared dumbfounded at the bathhouse. I circled the house, but there was no one around. At this, I was completely spooked, and ran back to the main house and told my great aunt and grandmother what happened. My aunt rubbed my back comfortingly, gave me some chocolates, and sat me on the dinner table. It happens more than you think, dear. Isaac likes to pull pranks. While I ate my chocolate, she explained how home renovations have been halted, as the workers would have their tools thrown at their heads or paint cans toppled over. Doors slam, and men swear to never come back and finish working. Times where she was out of town, and the stereo system in the barn would turn on full blast in the middle of the night, leaving the neighbors to call the police just for them to show up on an empty property with no one in sight. He seems to hate when the house is renovated or changed. There was one time where a couple was staying in a guest room, and even though it was summer, they could not go to sleep as the room was frigid cold. My aunt would run up and down the stairs delivering blankets to the couple, and though she understood what was happening, she wouldn't dare tell them. Isaac must have been in that room with them. This experience has left me questioning my skepticism in the paranormal. I can't understand how this could have happened. I've even asked my dad earlier this year if he remembered visiting, or if he had tried to prank me by banging on the door, but he couldn't even remember what visit I was talking about. I've plundered every avenue of exploration for the sound, but nothing comes up, other than the sure fact that someone definitely knocked on my door that day. The home is used for family gatherings for my dad's side of the family, and honestly I'm dreading going back again after that experience. I haven't been back since then, but I'm sure Isaac will remember me and pick on me again.
I work the 3 to 11 shift at a seasonally driven hotel. In the off-season, October to May, we go from 2 people at the front desk each shift to 1 person. I'm the supervisor, so I get stuck alone a lot. Last February-ish on a Monday around 10 p.m, the phone rings. I answer it with my usual hotel spiel. "Thank you for calling this hotel. How may I help you?" On the other end of the line was an Asian guy whose English was awful. He paused for a second before asking me something in Chinese. "I'm sorry, sir, I only speak English. I can transfer you to the reservations. They have a translator." Click. The dude hangs up on me. Okay, fine. Now my shift ends in an hour. I have a system down where I do all my closing reports, count my bank, all this stuff, get ready to leave. In the middle of counting my bank, the phone rings again. "Thank you for calling, how may I help you?" It was the same guy. At this point I was a tad annoyed, and I haven't transferred straight to reservation so they can find someone who understands what he needs. Not 5 seconds after I transfer him back, the phone rings again. It's the damn guy again, and in very broken English he asks to speak to Cho. I don't have a Cho who works here. I ask if they're a guest. The guy's talking very fast to someone in the background when a younger guy gets on the phone. "I'm very sorry to bother you, but my father is confused. Who am I speaking to?" I'm getting more annoyed by the second. Is it time for me to go yet? "Hi, this is the hotel. Who are you trying to reach today?" The son doesn't say anything for a second, then I hear him speaking to his dad in the background. After a few seconds of loud arguing, the son comes back, apologizes for bothering me, and hangs up. Then the phone rings again. It's the son. "Look, ma'am, I'm really sorry, but I'm not trying to call you. We've been trying to call my dad's best friend Cho all night. He had the same phone number for years, and we've never had a problem. It's only the past few times it reroutes to you." I tell him that my phone number is this, and he tells me the number he's trying to dial. I recognize it as the cell phone from my state, but it shouldn't reroute to my hotel. I get the son's number, tell him to try dialing Cho's number, and I'll let him know. Dial Mr. Cho, and instead of going to voicemail, it takes me to my hotel's extension options, where if you hit 0, you'll ring front desk. Okay, this is getting weird. I call the kid back and tell him my finding. The family is in panic when the son tells me the reason why they need to get a hold of this Cho. "Look, ma'am, I don't mean to freak you out, but Cho was fired from his job yesterday, and he's been acting very strange ever since. This morning he texted my dad basically a suicide note thanking him for being such a good friend, asking him to look out for his wife and daughter, and that he hopes they meet again someday. And Cho hasn't answered any calls since. We talked to the daughter a few hours ago, and she says he hasn't been home all day, and their handgun and rifle are both missing. Is there any way you can look up to see if he's staying there with you or something?" At this point I'm freaking out. It's quite dead in the hotel. I have maybe 10 rooms in the house. It's just me and the Mexican housekeeper there, and I know for a fact I haven't had any Asian gentlemen check in with us in over a week. I checked in everyone who came in that day, and I know for a fact there was no Mr. Cho at my hotel. I apologize profusely and explain that he's not here, and the best thing to do would be to contact his local police and report a missing person, and perhaps call my town police as well and reported to them too. I say that if I find anything out, I'll call them back. They thank me and we disconnect. It's 10:45 and it's creepy at the hotel. Is it possible someone checked in for him? Are the housekeepers going to walk in to find a dead guy in the morning? The overnight guy comes in and I don't tell him anything. He's already paranoid and weird to begin with. Telling him would make things worse. And I go home and dream a lot about suicidal people. Fast forward 3 days and the body of an unidentified man is found in the bay about 2 blocks from my hotel. He had a gunshot wound in his head. Later that day, he is identified by a family friend as Mr. Cho. It's definitely the scariest thing that's ever happened to me.
This happened when I was 25. I'm a female and had been dating a guy for about a year. Things were going great, and he asked me to meet his parents and invited me to have dinner at their family home. It was at his parents' house, where something unimaginable happened. My boyfriend was from the countryside, and his family still lives there. From where I lived, it took 3 hours to arrive by car. When I finally got to meet them, my boyfriend's attitude towards me changed dramatically, and it really surprised me. He was usually quite the gentleman, but in front of his parents he addressed me with such terms like you and oi. It was downright rude. He'd shout at me using these words like he was commanding me or something. He'd never treated me like this before, but since I was in his parents' home I would put up with it and gave him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, what else could I have done? I didn't want to make a scene and embarrass him. I could see where he got it from. His dad was throwing his weight around and bossing everyone. His father shouted commands at his mum when she was doing something not quite to his liking, and it was pretty harsh. I looked over at her and she just kept her head down and did what she was told, like this was totally normal. His family were giving off some seriously suspicious vibes, and I was starting to regret coming here at all. It felt so awkward and intimidating. At dinner, his father stared at me and said, "When you get married, you will live here." It caught me off guard. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a joke. It was a demand. I just focused on cutting up my food and waiting for my boyfriend to speak up for me, but he never did. So eventually I said, "Well, I haven't made any decisions about that yet." His dad glared at me. He looked so angry. "If you marry my son, you live here. Got it?" I couldn't believe it. He shouted at me, a guest. I stared at my boyfriend. He must have felt my eyes pleading with him for some sort of help or defense, but he was just as silent as his mother. It killed me when he looked at his father and just nodded. More to the point, my boyfriend had never mentioned marriage to me before, so I was totally shocked, and to be honest, our relationship had had its rocky moments. They started speaking of specific dates for a wedding, and the pressure was intensifying. Later after dinner, when I was alone with my boyfriend, I said, "Hey, I feel a bit sick. I want to go home. Something isn't quite right." He didn't say anything, so I decided to start gathering up my things and head home alone. Just as I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm. "Are you running away?" He boomed. He had totally changed. It was like I didn't know him at all. He forced me back into his childhood bedroom. He overpowered me and shut the door on me and locked it. I beat on the door and screamed for someone to let me out. I was making so much noise there was no way that no one else in the house wouldn't have heard me. Things got worse when I realized that I had left my phone on the chair downstairs, charging. I couldn't do anything. I was literally a prisoner. I was stunned. And after a while the door unlocked and my psycho boyfriend's mum entered the room. I was pleased to see her. I thought she had come to my aid, but my hopes were dashed instantly when she handed me some papers. "Sign this. It's your marriage certificate. If you do, you can go," she said in a monotone voice. It was the real deal. "I won't sign that. I'll never marry him." "You think you can escape? Go on, try." She asked me to sign it again and I told her where do I go. She got up and walked out the room and locked the door again. I needed to stay calm. I was terrified, sure, but I needed to keep my composure if I had a chance of leaving. I decided to wait until the dead of night, turned all the lights off in the room and kept as still as possible. Before shutting off all the lights, I figured the window would be my best and only option for escape. I would have to deal with injury if it happened. I opened the window and managed to climb down onto the porch roof silently. It was amazing. I walked all the night and reached the nearest train station. Fearing for my safety, I looked over my shoulder for that crazy mother and father. Days and weeks passed after this incident, and I got an email from my boyfriend asking, "You think that's the last of this? You think you can get away? We will not forgive you." Because I was living on my own at the time, I was too afraid to go back to my apartment alone. I asked friends and relatives to let me stay with them and pleaded. One friend who lived quite far from where I met my boyfriend allowed me to stay with them, and I felt safer. With the help of a lawyer and a support group, I achieved what he told me was impossible. I escaped from him and his family. I heard from friends and neighbors from my old life, and they say that they've seen him hanging around my former apartment and my old hangouts. Even though I live miles away from him now, I'm still worried he'll find me, or find a way to hurt me and my family. My husband was a trucker with a cross-country firm at the time. His driving partner separated from his girlfriend, and according to my husband, couldn't afford to get his own place. I did find that odd, as he made as much money as my husband, who clearly could afford the roof over our heads. My little one was a newborn, and I was off on maternity leave. So Buddy moves into our spare room and makes himself at home. And I do mean at home. He'd walk into the living room and change the channel while I was watching TV, or turn on the stereo, fry himself a steak as a midnight snack, or eat an entire box of donuts and thought nothing of it. He'd take a shower and drop his dirty clothes on the floor for me to pick up and wash. And he stared at me a lot. I found him creepy and inconsiderate and told my husband so. And finally, after a few months of arguing about our unwelcome charity case, who never paid a cent, I told my husband it was either him or me. This sparked a huge argument between the two of them, with Buddy accusing my husband of being whipped and not standing up for his friend. That did it for my husband, and he told the guy he needed to get out now. My husband drove him to a hotel, and we thought that was the end of it. The next day, we went to get groceries, as I had stopped buying anything but essentials so Buddy wouldn't eat us out of house and home. Imagine our shock when we get home and Buddy walks out of the kitchen wearing my husband's clothes and smoking his pipe. As you can imagine, feces hit the fan, and I went straight to the kitchen and phoned the police. In those days there was no 911, so it was taking a bit, and he heard me talking. He bolted out the house and we never saw him again, and he never showed up at work either. We discovered that he had broken a basement window to get in, so we boarded up the basement and changed the locks. Around a week or so later, I decided to use my cash nest egg that I had stashed in my underwear drawer, and it was gone, and I realized several pair of my underpants were gone as well. Gross. I considered phoning the cops again at that point, but we decided we didn't want to remind him of our existence, and we moved shortly after. I hope the next tenants never got an unexpected and unwelcome house guest. I went to Germany for a work trip. It was company affiliated, and a fun competition between several teams around Europe and us. Our first night there, I went out with a buddy of mine, hitting a few small bars after dinner. I had a few beers but was pretty sober, and was taking care of a friend who was pretty drunk. At the last bar, we each ordered a beer, and halfway through it I suddenly felt drunk. From sober to drunk in half a beer, my mind must have already been messed up, because I basically ignored it, and I let my friend walk off back to the hotel by himself, when he told me he wanted to leave. In any ordinary situation, I would have gladly went back with him then. The next thing I know, I'm walking up the sidewalk outside somewhere, with my wallet and over 100 euros in it and cell phone gone. Pieces of what happened start coming back to me, and I see flashes of being held down on the ground by 3 or 4 people while they were taking money. I'm pretty certain that the bartenders are responsible for drugging and robbing me. Afterwards, I remember finding a police station and trying to explain to them what happened, but they treated me like a drunken asshole and told me to piss off, and literally pushed me out of the police station. I finally managed to stumble my way back to my hotel, and have no idea how I made it out and found it. I was in a very paranoid state the whole time. Eventually, I hit my bed and passed out for 20 hours. I used to volunteer at a religious retreat. It was centuries old, and since I lived some distance away, I was given accommodation. I worked the evening shift in the on-site cafe bar and got back to my room shortly after midnight. I opened the door to my room, and just as the light came on, I saw a shadow shaped like a cat walk through my ankles and vanish. I had many experiences like this that could only be explained as the paranormal, but this one stuck with me, and obviously I never found any cat. My uncle was at his sister's house. Her grandson was going to run to get food, and asked my uncle if he wanted to tag along. He said he did, but he needed to put shoes on, and he would meet him upstairs in a few minutes. So the grandson walks down the hall and my uncle starts putting on his shoes. He looks up and sees the boy down the hallway just standing there staring at him. He tells him again he will meet him upstairs, and the boy turns and walks into the bathroom at the end of the hall and starts combing his hair. My uncle finishes putting his shoes on, and when he looks to the bathroom, the boy is closing the door. He figured he needed to use it, so he decides to wait until he gets out and keeps watching TV. So he waits and waits and waits. Half-hour goes by, so my uncle decides to just go up and wait for him upstairs. He gets up there and finds the grandson had left a long time ago. A few minutes later, the grandson is back. My uncle is totally confused and asked him when he left the bathroom. The boy had no idea what he was talking about and said he never combed his hair or anything. On top of that, the boy gets a little freaked out and shares his own story. One night he had stayed in the house and got up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water from the kitchen. His grandmother was sitting at the table, no lights, totally still. He stood there for a minute and it felt weird to him, so he walked back to his room. On his way back, he looked into his grandmother's room to see her sleeping in there. I guess my aunt has no idea that these things happened. They don't want her to be scared in her own home. But seriously, what the hell?
I was studying abroad in Thailand and went with a friend to an island, Koh Samui, for the weekend. Soon after checking into our dinky hotel, we rented motorbikes and cruised around the island, quickly getting lost on the back roads. It was no big deal. We found a little tiki bar and drank the night away, thinking, we'll figure out how to get home eventually. Fast forward to about midnight. We drank enough that motorbiking back to wherever the hell we came from suddenly seemed like a good idea. It's an island, right? Who gets lost on an island? So we set back in the general direction of the hotel. After about an hour of zigzagging around dirt roads, we passed something that smelled terrible, and I turned back to make a sour face at my friend. In a flash, I went off the side of the road and smashed the motorbike into an embankment that was what I assume a swamp of the town's sewage. By the time I realized what happened, I was almost fully submerged in trying to account for my body parts, let alone wipe my face and mouth clear of the revolting slush. I scrambled out, scratched, bruised, and shamed, but in one piece. The motorbike was stuck, half submerged. We yanked it out and somehow got it running again, then limped back towards the hotel. We eventually made it back to the hotel. It must have been at least 3 a.m. I stunk of crap and had a plethora of scratches and bruises that had been marinating for over an hour. So I sprinted to the hotel shower room like my life depended on it. After a few minutes of obsessive scrubbing, I emerged to an empty room with no friend in sight. So I went over to my suitcase to get dressed and looked for him. It was practically empty, save for a few t-shirts and underwear. Strange. I went for my backpack. Nowhere in sight. My friend's backpack. Not there. We were robbed. Frantically, I threw on a shirt and underwear and ran outside to find my friend banging on the door to the lobby. already aware our stuff was missing. Feeling drunk, hungover, and violated in multiple ways, I sprinted over to join him, banging and throwing rocks at the window until someone responded and helped us report the crime. Before long, a little old man poked his head around from the corner of the building. We yelled for his attention and he darted away. We chased. He reappeared this time, wielding a machete. We let out a massive, "Oh crap," and he shouted something that we obviously couldn't understand, and we bolted as fast as we could, running until we were absolutely certain he couldn't find us. Not even sure if he chased, to be honest. We ended up far away at another beach resort, me Winnie the Poohing my t-shirt and underwear, and my friend gross from a day of motorbiking and swamp wading, and had no idea what to do. We had no hotel, no passport, no clothes, and our wallets and phones were back in the recently robbed hotel room, where a little old man was waiting for us with a machete. Defeated, we passed out on the resort's beach chairs and allowed mosquitoes to feast on our helpless bodies until the sun rose. That morning we limped back to the hotel, snuck into the room, grabbed all that was left of our possessions. Thankfully it wasn't robbed twice and our wallets were safe. I bought a bathing suit to wear over my underwear, and then we swiftly got the hell out of that miserable little hell realm of an island. And to this day it remains my most horrible travel/vacation experience, as well as one of my favorite stories to share. Just be careful where you book your hotels, guys.
When I was at university, I had a good friend who was really good looking, but she never had a boyfriend or showed any interest in men. I was very curious about this, so I asked her the reason why I never saw her with a boyfriend. She said there were 2 reasons. She told me she had a boyfriend in high school who became obsessed with her. When she couldn't take it any longer, she spoke to him about mutually ending the relationship. He exploded with rage and attacked her. The second reason, before university she commuted to school on the train. One day she found something in her bag, a mysterious sealed envelope. She guessed that someone slipped it into her bag aboard the crowded train. The letter was very simple and only said a few words. Love at first sight. It was a creepy kind of love letter. It wasn't addressed to her, it didn't have her name written on it. The envelope just creeped her out. Thereafter, she found a new letter in her bag each week. She said she did nothing to encourage these letters. Since this freaked her out, she stopped traveling to school on train. A few days after, she received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. Oh God, she thought, this is freaky. She didn't answer the call but saved the number as stalker. A few days passed, and she set up an answer phone to see if the stalker would leave a message, and she was surprised that they did. Her hands were shaking when she listened. Why did you go away? Why did you leave me? She said that she began to develop a fear of leaving the house and a fear of men. It took her years to recover from the fear instilled in her, not only from her ex-boyfriend but the train stalker too. Once she had her confidence back, she attended university. I wanted to help her get a sense of trust in men again, as there are so many good men out there. I knew that I was meddling, but I wanted to help, so I thought I would invite her to a party with males and females in attendance. I floated the idea to her and she reluctantly accepted. The day of the party arrived. I invited some of my best friends and male friends who I trusted and warned them all of my friend, that she was nervous, and asked them to be on their best behavior. My friends understood and promised to make the atmosphere great for the party. The party was held by our college mentor. I was so proud of her. She spoke to a man for the first time in a very long time and they had a really lengthy conversation. It was good and healthy to see. The guy she spoke to had the exact same taste in music and movies as she did, to the point where they had the same favorite song. They even came from the same area. They could have talked all night, they had so much in common, and I felt like fate had brought them together. When the party was over, he asked her for her contact. I knew this was going to be a big step, and I could tell she was happy with this, but she was too shy to show it. She said to me after the party on the way home that she was so happy and that she could fall in love with anyone else now. I was happy for her and felt just as excited as she did. A few days later, she received an email from him. She was pleased, as you can imagine, and I respected him for taking things slowly. After a week of emailing, she came running into my room to tell me that he had invited her on a date. The day of the date arrived, and my friend didn't want to be late, so she left her home with plenty of time. He sent an email stating, "I'll be there shortly and I'll let you know when I arrive." My friend decided to wait for him in the cafe. The cafe was crowded, so she emailed him with her number and asked him to call her when he got there. 15 minutes later, and her phone rang. It's him, she thought gleefully. And as she pulled out her phone, one word appeared on screen. Stalker? Her heartbeat rose. Old familiar thoughts and fears crept forcing from the back of her mind. She calmed herself and told herself, "I'm okay. My boyfriend's coming. I'll be safe." She decided to answer the phone. "Hello? Hi, I'm here. Where are you?" It was the voice of the man she'd met at the party. Her new boyfriend. There was no mistake. He must have been the ones who put the letters in her bag on the train. She called me as she was leaving and said, "I have no luck with men." She escaped the letter stalker with the help of her friends and colleagues. I don't know what they did, but they made him back off. I'm shocked and somewhat in awe at the stalker's fascination and persistence with my friend. I wish he had just left her alone. I was a domiciliary carer in a small town in the UK. This meant I had to go from house to house to provide personal care and support for elderly and disabled people in their own home. My shifts were variable from a nice and easy short to a lengthy split shift. This meant I started at 7 a.m. in the morning and finished at 10:30 in the evening. One day my manager called me in the office to have a meeting about a couple of new clients, which a few had fallen off my route that day. She handed me over the care plans and other files including care notes, where you have to document everything you have done to the client on the time of visit, including personal care, housekeeping tasks, and documenting medications. So she told me to have a nice late shift and sent me back to work with the brand new client. As I found the address, I was a bit creeped out by the look of the client's house. It was a detached 2-story house with an untidy, abandoned-looking garden. Windows were opaque from years of dirt built up on the glass panes. The staircase windows were covered with sheets of building site plastic wraps, and I opened the gate and walked to the side of the house where the main entrance was. The door was a simple UPVC door with a door cam fitted to the right side of the frame with a doorbell button. I pressed the button, heard the doorbell ring inside, and shortly after a vicious dog barked from inside. A few moments later, a middle-aged man looked out of the window from my right side of the door and asked me, "What do you want?" I introduced myself as Frank, and that I was from the care company, and that was here to help him in his daily life. He reluctantly let me into his home, and as I entered, the hairs on the back of my head started to rise. The inside of his house was a huge mess. Dog hairs covered the floor in thick layers. The smell of untidiness was overwhelming. I need to describe the layout of his home for you to understand. As I stepped in on my immediate left, there was the staircase leading to the upper floor, barricaded with a child barrier. On my right were a wardrobe for coats and shoes. In front of me were the door of the living room and the lounge, and on the far right was a short lobby leading into the dining room and kitchen. So my client invited me to have a seat in the lounge and we started to talk. The guy seemed okay, and I had a chat with him, mainly to convince him about the service we provided, and he needs it because of his living conditions. The conversation went fine. I had spent my allocated visit time just to make him comfortable with the service we provided. Everything went fine, so my unease had gone, and I realized my allocated visit time had drawn to an end. I had to say goodbye to the client after I was done with my care notes, and I have another route for the next few weeks, and had completely forgotten about that creepy house, and the rather creepy man to take care of. When I noticed in my schedule that I have him again for 2 hours to spend like cleaning his home and such. No personal care was in sight because this client was very shy. When I go, I'm given the task to vacuum his dining room, which I started doing, but the vacuum cleaner didn't work. I wondered why. I turned the vacuum cleaner over and saw all the brushes were thickly covered with dog hair. I cleaned it out as best I could and started to clean his dining room out when a big chunk of grey carpet was ripped off by the vacuum cleaner. I freaked out. I had now destroyed his carpet. When I realized his carpet wasn't grey at all but a nice magenta. It looked grey because of years' worth of dog hair stomped into the carpet. I grabbed a knife and used it as a spatula to try and get the dog hairs out. When I loosened up the dog hairs, I started to roll up the carpet. It was so thick. I took it out to the front yard as the backyard was an utter jungle with overgrowth and weeds, as well as other vegetation. It was impossible for me to move in the backyard. Then I was greeted by his next door neighbor, Jack. "Hello, how are you doing? Are you moving Joe out?" he asked, as I returned his greeting and said, "No, I'm just cleaning out his house. I'm only here for domestic reasons." "Well, good luck with him," Jack said. The unease had returned to me, but I tried brushing it off. I managed to clean his dining room and make it look like a dining room instead of a dog kennel, and I wrote in my care notes and moved on to my next client. The following week I had him again, and my next task was the kitchen, so I started to clean up the rather messy kitchen. The washing up sink felt like I was working in a sewer instead of a sink. When I finally managed to clear up the mess and clean and tidy Joe's kitchen cupboards, I went to rinse my cloth out when I saw him standing at the kitchen door. I did not realize the situation at my first glance, so I turned to the sink to rinse. I was a domiciliary carer in a small town in the UK. This meant I had to go from house to house to provide personal care and support for elderly and disabled people in their own home. My shifts were variable from a nice and easy short to a lengthy split shift. This meant I started at 7 a.m. in the morning and finished at 10:30 in the evening. One day my manager called me in the office to have a meeting about a couple of new clients, which a few had fallen off my route that day. She handed me over the care plans and other files including care notes, where you have to document everything you have done to the client on the time of visit, including personal care, housekeeping tasks, and documenting medications. So she told me to have a nice late shift and sent me back to work with the brand new client. As I found the address, I was a bit creeped out by the look of the client's house. It was a detached 2-story house with an untidy, abandoned-looking garden. Windows were opaque from years of dirt built up on the glass panes. The staircase windows were covered with sheets of building site plastic wraps, and I opened the gate and walked to the side of the house where the main entrance was. The door was a simple UPVC door with a door cam fitted to the right side of the frame with a doorbell button. I pressed the button, heard the doorbell ring inside, and shortly after a vicious dog barked from inside. A few moments later, a middle-aged man looked out of the window from my right side of the door and asked me, "What do you want?" I introduced myself as Frank, and that I was from the care company, and that was here to help him in his daily life. He reluctantly let me into his home, and as I entered, the hairs on the back of my head started to rise. The inside of his house was a huge mess. Dog hairs covered the floor in thick layers. The smell of untidiness was overwhelming. I need to describe the layout of his home for you to understand. As I stepped in on my immediate left, there was the staircase leading to the upper floor, barricaded with a child barrier. On my right were a wardrobe for coats and shoes. In front of me were the door of the living room and the lounge, and on the far right was a short lobby leading into the... I was acquaintances with an engineer who worked with a friend of mine. He had a bad drinking problem, compounded by the fact that he was one of those people who could drink for hours and appear relatively sober, then suddenly be slobbering drunk. Bars would overserve him because of this. One night in winter, well below freezing temperatures, he did this. The bartender notices how drunk he's suddenly acting and cuts him off. He gives him a water and calls a cab, but has to take care of other customers as well. When the cab gets there, the drunk guy is nowhere to be found. He'd slipped out and driven off. On his way home, he put his car in the ditch in his drunken stupor. He got out to walk and ended up slipping down a creek bank. At that point, he apparently curled up around a tree and went to sleep. When they found him the next morning, he was just a solid block of ice frozen to death. An engineer in a moderately large town in the most modern country in the world, and he still died of exposure. I worked in a group home for kids under the age of 5. It was Christmas Day, and I worked the night shift. There was only one toddler in the house overnights, as the rest of the kids went home to visit with their parents. I was the one staff on shift, as that's all that was needed for an overnight with one child in the home. The home had lots of ghost stories associated with it. I had experienced a few creepy incidences, but this one became my most memorable and most shared ghost story of the house. I arrived on night shift before midnight, completed shift change with the other staff, and they went home. I did my cleaning and food prep and decided to put on a movie. I did a bag check when I first got there, and in the middle of gathering the laundry from the rooms upstairs, where I saw the one toddler sleeping away in his crib. While I was watching the movie, I heard a loud bang from upstairs. My worst fear was that the toddler somehow got out of his crib and fell. I was getting up to check on him, and I heard something running across the floor above me, loud enough that it sounded like a small child, or so I thought. Oh no, he's out of his crib and he's going to hurt himself running around in the dark. So I ran up the stairs 2 at a time and busted into his room, only to find him sleeping soundly in his crib. I was terrified and put on a pot of black coffee and jittered the whole night away until the kiddo woke up at 6 a.m. The rest of the bed checks that night were very quick, and I made sure all lights were turned on at all times where necessary. When I was in 8th grade, I went on a school trip that was called the Louisiana Tour. It was mostly going around to significant sites in South Louisiana. One of the places we went to was the Myrtle Plantation, which is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the country. There were all kinds of stories about the place, but at one point we were standing in a room as a part of a larger group, and the tour guide was talking about something. I don't remember what. As I'm standing there, I started to hear what sounds like someone hitting a piano key. After I heard it a few times, I began to look around for the source of the noise, but didn't see a piano, although I kept hearing it. I asked one of my friends who was standing near me if they heard it, and they said no. When I heard it again, I said, there it is, and that they must have heard it. They thought I was crazy. So I went back to looking around the room. Everyone's eyes were on the tour guide except for one woman. She caught my eye and pointed at me, and then at her ear with a questioning look. I realized she was asking if I heard it too, and I nodded. At this point, the tour guide starts telling a story about a soldier who had died there, and that he played the piano, and multiple guests have reported hearing him playing in the night. I honestly didn't know what to think. I guess I still don't. I talked to the woman as well as we were leaving the room, and she had heard the exact same thing as me, but her husband and son hadn't heard a thing.
A few years ago, we went on a church trip to one of our favorite concerts that runs on New Year's Eve to celebrate the new year. Not only is it concerts, it has all kinds of other events and things to do beside the music. We decided to go super last minute, and a lot of the hotels in the area were booked. We ended up staying in a rinky-dink little roadside motel, about a half hour from all the events, and pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The entire place was sketchy, and made me uncomfortable, but I felt like we could deal with it. So we were separated, boys in a room, girls in a room, and then chaperones. We get into the room and the first thing we notice is a back door. What kind of hotel has a back door? The chaperones staying next door insisted that it's sealed shut, but still let us know if anyone knocks on it to not hesitate to let them know by knocking on the wall or whatever. No sooner than 5 minutes later, one of the guys comes to our room and, jealous of our back door, throws it open, proving that it wasn't sealed shut as we were told. We locked it and went about our business. Late that night at about 11:30 to midnight, we get back to our hotel and our chaperones tell us to lock the doors because there were men sitting outside drinking, very obviously drunk, as they started catcalling us because we went to our room. I didn't think much of it, and slammed and locked the door, which the young girls in our room decided would be completely okay to always answer without looking first, because, well, why would they be knocking on our door if they didn't know us, was their logic. Not okay. And I had to explain to them that you always need to look to see who you're opening for, obviously. Anyway, late that night, I was woken up by an odd sound, almost like tapping. I sat up and glanced around the room before I realized someone was knocking on our door. I very quietly got out of bed, careful to move as silently as possible, and went to the door to check on the peephole. No sooner had I glanced out, a hand slowly covered the peephole to hide two of the men that had been drinking outside earlier, and my heart started racing. I slowly got back to bed, trying to stay quiet and calm as the knocking persisted, only to see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, and realize there was someone standing there at the back door as well, barely visible through the blurry tinted window. One of the girls I was with woke up too. Confused, she looked at me. I used my phone to explain the situation silently as we both waited, terrified, as we watched the shadows through the window and hoped they would leave soon. At some point we both managed to fall asleep again, but when I left the room the next morning, there was a paper on the ground in very shaky, messy handwriting, and it read, "Seeing your pretty eye was enough." I can still remember that note perfectly, even after I shredded it and flushed it down the toilet to avoid anyone finding it. I was young and stupid. Looking back now, I know 100% I should have went straight to a chaperone and told them what happened. It could have been a very dangerous situation, and I'm extremely grateful that I was awoken rather than one of the other younger girls, who would have probably opened the door without checking. I'm also grateful that I triple-checked the doors to make sure they were locked. However, at the same time, it also didn't seem like a big deal to me. Nothing came of it besides extreme paranoia for a while. But all in all, the only long-term bad effect was a permanent bad feeling and fear of roadside motels.
I'm going to warn you now, if you're easily triggered, please consider stopping here. This is true and a real experience which happened while I was delivering newspapers early one winter's morning. It was around 4 and it was freezing. I was out on my usual paper route delivering newspapers. The whole neighborhood was still shrouded in complete darkness. The bitter winds were blowing strong. I was approaching an apartment block with my papers, and as I was heading out to a dark corner of the building, I heard a voice, and it sounded like people were talking. What the hell were people doing up at this hour out in the cold, I wondered, and squinted my eyes in order to get a better look. As I drew closer, I saw there was a woman doubled over and crouching in the hallway before me. Instantly I knew something was wrong. As I got closer, I noticed that all the woman was wearing was her underwear. Why was she out here in the freezing midwinter morning, alone with no clothes on? She was shivering. I went over to her and asked her what happened, if she was okay or if she needed any help, but she wouldn't reply. I couldn't stand to see her like that. Before long she would freeze, her lips were already beginning to turn blue. I took my coat off and tried to put it around the woman, and she pleaded with me not to give her the coat and tried to push it off. She muttered something about if her husband saw her with the coach, he'd be in trouble. In that moment, I knew I had to do something. I suspected domestic violence and I called the police. While I waited for the cops to arrive, I waited with the woman by her front door. She still wouldn't say a word. I didn't know how long she'd been out there. It was truly sad and haunting to see that woman alone in her underwear on a dark, cold winter morning. While we were waiting for the police, her front door burst open, her husband came rushing out, and he started shouting at her. She cowered as he threw a punch at her, and I obviously intervened, and thankfully I was strong enough to protect her until the police arrived. The woman broke down, told them that this wasn't the first time that he had forced her onto the cold in just her underwear. So it seems like this kind of thing happened all the time, which made me sick to my stomach. I've always tried to see the best in people, but this incident rocked my confidence in human beings being decent. I mean, to throw your half-naked wife out into the cold. Humans are the worst. I was about 5 years old when my dad and I drove up to my sister's high school to pick her up from sports practice. He asked me to walk to the gym to tell her it was time to go home. It wasn't dark outside, but it was well after school hours, and there weren't people milling about on campus. Everything was quiet, and there was no one around. I was walking along this outdoor breezeway when this older man approached me. He had dark, wavy hair, a big mustache, tight jeans, and a paisley brown and cream shirt. I can still see him in my mind today. He stopped me to supposedly ask directions somewhere, and then he started asking me other questions. He squatted down to my eye level and asked me how old I was, what grade I was in, and finally what my name was. When I told him my name, he said, "Hey, that's my name too, isn't that cool?" And I believed him, and asked if he could walk with me. I remember feeling very uncomfortable and intimidated, but I was going to go with him anyway because he was an adult, and it never occurred to me that I didn't have to go with him. I was supposed to do what adults told me, in my little kid mind, and if I didn't, well, it meant I had bad manners, and I took pride in being a polite and well-mannered child, something other adults would often compliment about me. And then there was the fact that he had been nice to me, so I didn't want to be rude to him. As I started to walk with him, my dad suddenly came rushing up, took me by the hand and said something in a harsh tone to the mustached man. He quickly turned heel and walked away fast, and I remember being confused, because even though he made me feel weird, he had been so nice and friendly, and now he was rushing off without even saying goodbye. Still, I was relieved that my dad was there because it meant I didn't have to go with this man who made me feel uncomfortable. I come to find out my dad was parked in a place where from his car he could see me still, so when he saw the man squatting down to talk to me, he knew something was off and that I could have been in danger. With the benefit of hindsight as an adult, I feel without a doubt that this man was a child predator, and I shudder to think what could have happened had my dad not seen what was going down and come to my aid. Around 15 years ago, my friend Poe picked me up to go nightclubbing. What we did most weekends. This was one of those giant nightclubs outside of town, in the countryside. Poe and I were really enjoying the dancing, no drinking, pulling our best moves and smiling along. For once, two guys seemed interested in dancing with us as well. No funny business, unusual but nice and good fun. Come to the end of the evening, Poe and I are going to her car in the nearest deserted parking lot. These two guys tag along, and Poe asked them how they planned to go home, and the two answer that their group of friends had left a while back, and that we had to take them back now. I reply that we didn't have to do anything, to which one of the guys pushes me against the open car door and says, "But we're having geese for dinner." I'm creeped out and can't retreat anywhere. Thankfully, my friend Poe closes the passenger door onto the guy's fingers, which made him remove his hands, and I can get away from him. His friend being a lot nicer, Poe gives in and accepts to give them a ride. We were far from town, before mobile phones were that common, and they would have literally been stranded. Poe asked that both of them ride in the back. I settle in the back of the small car, and Poe begins to drive. But after a few kilometers, the two guys start touching our hair and necks and keep repeating, "We're having geese for dinner tonight." That's when we clicked. They were talking about us. We were the geese. Poe kept her cool and casually asked me to put my seatbelt on. The two guys at the back didn't catch up with the comment. Poe accelerated, cheered by our passengers, then slams on the brakes. She and I had our belts on. We were a bit shaken, but the two guys hit the front seats hard and were in shock. Not thinking, I unbuckle my seatbelt, open the back door, drag both of them from the car, and they just stand there rubbing their noses. I climb back, lock the door, and Poe floors it. We shook it all the way back to my flat, and acted totally paranoid for weeks. We never heard from them again, nor saw them at the nightclub. But one thing's for sure, thanks to Poe's quick thinking, we were off the menu. I hated working the night shift at the grocery store. I honestly never thought of exploring the store at night. I'd just stick to the milks and freezer. But one day I had to walk over to the damn meat section to get something with half the lights off. I just remembered the one time, I swear to God, a dude just kept chopping up meat in the dark until I came over to turn the light on. I swear I friggin' ran, knocked stuff over and told my team I was going for a smoke break. That thing/person for some reason followed me and stood outside smoking. Didn't say a thing, and I just ran home that night and called it in. Apparently there was a light in the back that was shining enough for him to work. I didn't buy it though. I got fired. It was better that way. I'm from Victoria, Australia, and when I was little, I lived in a small town with my 3 sisters, one of which was my twin. Not that it's important, but it adds context. My mother was also with us, but she and my father were divorced, so it was just us. My father has always stood by his encounters, of which he believes to be a ghost. He lived there for a very short time before he and my mother split, so he had very few experiences to regale me with. One night, he was sleeping next to my mother, and he kept hearing her whisper, and it was bothering him, as he had to get up early for work, so he told her to be quiet and let him sleep. A few moments later, he felt her right next to his ear, and her breath brushed his earlobe, and he turned over in frustration, ready to tell her off, but his mouth remained open, as she was dead asleep and silent, as still as the pillow she lay. He was stunned, and when he asked her about it the next morning, she had no idea what he was talking about. Another time, when we were all young, he had put me and my sisters all to bed and sat out in the living room and watched the TV. Then a little while later, he heard running up and down the hallway. He assumed it was us mucking about and not staying in our beds, so he got up and walked up the hallway to our shared bedroom and saw we were all fast asleep. We were little children and definitely would not be convincing actors, as he knew we were definitely asleep. A chill went up his spine, and he kept running up the hallway, and every time he checked, we hadn't moved a muscle. One thing I remember is waking up to the feeling of being shoved out of bed. I recall feeling pushed very hard out of my single bed, so hard I actually landed a few feet away, and my side hurt when I got back up. Of course, being a child, I didn't even know what a ghost was, but I was certainly confused, but went back to sleep, as my sisters were asleep, and there was no one there to have possibly shoved me out of bed in the middle of the night. Years later, in a completely different house in a different town my family and I moved to, I had heard the story that a man hung himself in the shed outside. That was creepy enough, but I had no choice. From the very first night I stayed there, I felt a feeling of dread, and like I was being watched. I felt extremely uncomfortable. Most nights, all of us heard the shed door banging all throughout the night, even though it was shut. So my mother placed a large rock in the front of the door, so it couldn't bang against the metal of the shed. But somehow it still created loud bangs every night. My mother was not a very responsible mother, and I would be left on my own a lot in this house when she and my sisters went out. I always felt a little scared, but I had our 2 terriers with me to keep me company. One winter night it was freezing, and the house had no central heating. I was 13 at this point, and had watched my mother light fires multiple times, so I took it upon myself to get a roaring fire going in the fireplace. I was quite proud of my effort, and the living room heated up nicely, and I watched TV and sat there most of the night. My bedroom was freezing, so I decided to drag my mattress out and sleep in the living room where it was warm. I laid down with my eyes closed and tried to fall asleep, but I had that feeling of being watched. I tossed and turned on the mattress and patted my dog that was next to me. It was all silent besides the crackling fire. The light orange glow illuminated the room as a soft yellow, and I looked up at the ceiling to try and lull myself to sleep. I shut my eyes again when suddenly I heard footsteps coming from the left of me, all the way near the front door, which was about 7 meters away. I froze on the spot after looking towards the door and saw no one, but I still heard footsteps that then turned into running. The room was darker now, as the firelight started to dim. The footsteps were so clear, it was as if they were right next to my head. They ran towards me and I grabbed my dog and rolled over in fear, and clutched my dog with a fierce need of protection. Nothing happened. It sounded like they ran right up to me and then just disappeared. I was petrified. My chest quickly moved, and I could hear my heart thrumming quickly in my head. I wasted no time and grabbed my mattress and dragged back to my bedroom and made my bed and shut my bedroom door and laid in it. I had no cell to call my mother, so I had to put up with the fear. Half hour after settling down in bed, I started to calm down. That was until I noticed my dog sitting at the end of the bed with his ears pricked up and his posture very stiff and his head cocked, like he could hear or see something. I heard my door creak open, and my dog started growling. I yelled at my dog to shut up, and huddled up in the blankets. I heard my door creak again, and knew it was open. My dog's head followed something I couldn't see. I ignored my fear and screamed to nothing, "Leave me alone!" And I ran to my door, which I suspected open. I had no idea how it was open when I shut it. I slammed it shut, ran to my bed, grabbed my dog and held him close, and after what felt like hours, did I fall asleep. Nothing happened after that, but the shed door still slammed every night, and nothing we did stop it. I also have a younger cousin who was extremely close to my great-grandmother who died when she was barely a year old. My nana loved her very much, but my younger cousin was seen talking and laughing by herself and talking to no one. Well, at least, no one you could see. She was a toddler when she was asked who she was talking to, and she'd say, "Nana Duncan." This would creep her parents out no end. It happened in the back of cars, and she'd also claimed to be talking to my great-grandfather, who she'd never met, as he sadly died a long time before she was born. She would say, "Poppy Duncan," and say, "He says he misses you." This would happen quite often, and my whole family believes my great-grandparents visit her after their physical selves have left. Another creepy thing involving the same cousin was my father sleeping downstairs at my grandparents' house. The second story was underground like a basement, but it was just another living room with an ensuite. My father had a nightmare in that room, that it was covered in snakes. He woke up and didn't mention it to anyone, as it was unimportant to anything. Later that day, my cousin visited her parents. She turned to my father and pointed downstairs and said, "There's snakes down there, aren't there?" she said with a laugh. This shook my dad. He told my grandparents what happened, and they were all baffled on how the young girl knew what he had dreamed of, or was it just a mere coincidence? I don't believe it was. These are mine and my family's strange experiences. I have no idea what to even call my young cousin, but it's certainly creepy.
I was on vacation with my sister and parents, and stopped in a southern state at a motel for the night. Our first room had weird dents in the door and no lock, so my parents requested a different room. The guy working there seemed annoyed, but did move us, and told us about the mall down the road, and mentioned it's close enough that my sister and I could walk there without dragging my parents out. Little odd to say, but he was right, it was super close. So of course we beg our parents to let us go. They agree since it was daylight out, and we were both around 15. We started walking there when some guy in a pickup truck pulled over and asked if we needed a ride. He was a normal-looking guy, seemed genuinely concerned for us, and we explained we were nearly reaching our destination but thanked him for the offer nonetheless. He pulled away and we kept walking. The mall was boring, so we decided to walk home shortly after. I see the guy parked in his truck and mention it to my sister. She agrees it was a bit creepy, but we kept walking. This was before cell phones, so we couldn't just call my parents. He pulls away only to circle around and begin following us. We quicken our pace and I notice my sister is grabbing her self-defense keychain mace. Once near the motel, we see him stop at the front office and talk to the guy who switched our rooms, then continue to follow us. He yells up, "Hey, me and my buddy want to know if you want to party tonight." We responded with a quick, "No thanks," and he speeds up. We book it running to the room. Finally we get there and tell my parents. My dad says, "Oh, so that's why the guy wanted us in the room with no lock," and storms out. Not sure what happened after that, but pretty sure my dad decked the office guy in the face. Cops were called, office guy and truck guy were arrested for human trafficking. Yeah, wish we'd caught on sooner, but never have we been so happy that we were both on the track team.
There is a huge park near my house. On weekends and public holidays it gets really busy. However, at night the atmosphere of the park is entirely different. Back when I had just moved into the area, I was unpacking. I had so much to do and there wasn't an end in sight, so I decided to go to the park for a change of pace. The park had swings and slides, plenty of stuff. Next to a public toilet there was a phone booth illuminated in the darkness that creeped me out a bit. Later, when I had finally finished unpacking, it was around 1 a.m, and decided to go to a convenience store. The whole time I was walking, I felt as if someone was watching me. I didn't want to look over my shoulder at any point. There was the phone booth. Ordinarily, I would walk past it without paying it much attention, but for some reason I stopped and stared blankly at it. After a few minutes, I snapped out of it and ran to the convenience store and bought a few more things, sweets, a bento box, and went on my way home. Halfway through the park, I realized I was desperate to go to the toilet. It was unavoidable. I had to use the toilet in the park. At that time of night, I was the only one in the park and it was quite frightening. As I was washing my hands, I heard a phone ring. I checked, but it wasn't my mobile. It was coming from somewhere very close to the toilet though. The payphone was ringing. What perfect timing, I thought. Two thoughts entered my mind. The first, curiosity. What if I answer it? The second, fear. Do not answer it. In the end, fear won. I ran back home while the phone rang behind me. Back home, I sat down on my sofa and tried to organize my thoughts. I was still thinking about the phone booth. From my window, I could see the park and phone booth. I wasn't sure if it was still ringing. I watched for a few moments as a man appeared from a nearby toilet. The light of the toilet illuminated him. In his right hand he was holding a mobile phone, and his left, something sharp, like a tool or a knife. It took only 2 minutes to run back to my house from the park. I was just there. I thought there was no one else in the toilet with me. My suspicion is that the man was waiting in one of the other stalls and dialed the payphone number, and would creep up to whoever answered the phone from behind and murder them. What if my curiosity was greater than my fear? Whenever I think about what could have happened, I shudder. I grew up in rural Texas, in a small town, with a crippling meth problem. No positive outlets for people to do activities like a movie theater or park, and we didn't even have a large grocery store just to hang out in. The teens mostly just ended up drinking, driving, and going to bonfires, but quite a few of the teenage boys in my neighborhood decided that being evil was the best way to have fun. They would literally go out of their way while either trying to drive and swerve and scare younger kids riding bikes, or poison loose dogs and even set fire to a few of the trailers in my neighborhood while people were still inside them. Only one arrest was ever made in connection to the arsons, but it had definitely been a group activity. My neighborhood was a trailer park, in which each trailer was placed on a few acres of land, with at least some forested area between each plot of property. The road was an older dirt road with gravel and rocks poured over the dirt, which is what I had to learn to ride a bike on. It was difficult. One day when I was around 10, I was doing my best to ride the bike on this rock road without falling while riding away from my house when I saw my older sister, who was about 16 at the time, sprinting alongside the road towards me from the opposite direction. I was going very slow, trying to keep my balance, but decided to just get off the bike when I noticed how panicked my sister looked. I saw a dust cloud coming from the road, but a fairly large hill was blocking the view of my sister from any vehicles that were coming towards us. When my sister got to me, she grabbed my arm so hard that I winced in pain, and she pulled me away from the bike. By this time, the truck that was producing the dust trail was just coming over the hill, but it was still fairly far away, so I didn't think they noticed us. There are woods around 10 feet on both sides of the road, where I and my sister were, as my sister was pulling me into the woods on the left side of it. I complained and was asking her what was going on, but she told me to hurry. We made it about 30 feet into the woods when my sister dropped to the ground and pulled me with her. She covered my mouth and told me to be quiet. Again, I complied, and I saw the vehicle she was worried about. A black truck filled with 5 guys that were in their late teens or very early 20s. The truck screeched to a stop right where my bike was, and I froze solid when I heard my sister whisper, "Crap." 3 of the guys got out the car, but they didn't say anything. It was clear that they were looking very intensely into the woods on both sides of the road. Luckily, for some reason I'm not sure of, they all lined up and started approaching and walking into the woods on the opposite side of the road. They were talking, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. I was worried that they would take their time looking for us, since only a handful of people lived this far down the road, and it could have taken hours before another car would pass through. It took about 5 minutes of perfect stillness and silence before one did, though. One of the guys had already placed my bike into the back of the truck, and then they noticed another car coming over the hill behind them. They quickly jumped into the truck and sped off. We waited at least 10 minutes before we stood up and started the walk back home, although we walked right along the tree line instead of the road itself, just in case. My sister didn't say much to me, but told my mum when we got home that one of the boys that she had been hanging out with was talking about wanting to kill some of the annoying kids in the neighborhood, and she assumed that it would be a good bet that one of those annoying kids might end up being one of her 3 younger siblings. It could have been any of us, but I was the one that wanted to go ride my bike alone that day instead of playing video games with my 2 brothers. She decided to head home when none of the other guys seemed to go against the guy talking about wanting to kill kids, or even jokingly escalate his desire to kill annoying kids with more detail. She'd been running home and just got enough of a head start before the boys hopped into their truck to stop whatever they might have done. The cops were informed, but apparently the boys disagreed, and parents claimed they never left the trailer, so nothing ever came of it. I knew 2 of the boys' names because we lived in the same neighborhood in a small town, and I know they never got less evil. They later invited my sister to a bonfire party everyone was going to be at, but my sister decided not to go, and when she asked all her friends how the party was, literally no one knew about it. This is because she was the only one they invited. She stayed away from them ever since, and fortunately, neither of us live there anymore. Of the 2 that I knew, one is currently incarcerated for several drug-related offenses, but the other one is still out there. As for the other 3 that were in the truck, I have no idea where they are or what they're up to. So to the garbage boys in the truck, you can keep my bike, because I hope we never meet again. So this is a story that I always think is funny because it's super relieving. It was such a close call. It happened during my mum's junior year of college, 1990, in Boston, while she went to UMass. She was at a nightclub and started talking to some guy. He seemed, in her words, rough around the edges, but nice enough. He was a rough construction worker, 6'4" and fairly muscular, while my mum was only 5'4" and probably 100 pounds, like a stick. So one of her friends was drunk, and the other had gone to hook up with whoever, and they lived outside of the city in an apartment, so my mum couldn't take the subway. The guy offers her a ride, and my mum grew up in a very sheltered existence in Puerto Rico before leaving home for college. Her graduating class of high school was only 27, so she wasn't exactly street smart when it came to strangers. She says okay, but then she knew something was wrong the moment she stepped into the car, and he locked the doors. This was a pretty bad sign. So the guy starts putting the moves on her, rubbing her wrist and arm, trying to say he's going to take her home and show her a good time. My mum's super creeped out, and is frozen because she's only 100 pounds and built like a twig. She starts to argue the only way she can fight back. Right at that moment she hears a, "Hey buddy, what the hell do you think you're doing?" from outside. She sees nothing, only a bush, and this threw the guy off enough that he stopped talking, while he tried to figure out what happened. Then some half-naked guy jumps out of the bush in his boxers and starts knocking on the door, and the guy says to my mum to get out angrily and kicks her out, since the guy was almost his size. As he sped off, my mother goes over to thank the guy. As she's thanking him, her friend who'd gone to hook up with someone comes out of the bush wearing her t-shirt and panties, saying how scared she was. So that's the story about how my mum got saved by a talking bush, all because her friend was a total freak. Which, in this scenario, was a great thing. I worked evenings as a closing manager at a store that closed at 9. A dude pulled up at about 4:30 p.m. and sat there for half hour, and then from 5 until 9 would go out and dig in his red toolbox for a while, and then go back and sit in the truck in pattern. I joked that he was going to rob us, but as the night went on his pattern never changed. So at 9 he still hadn't left and was messing around in his toolbox. I called the police, and I thought he must have been waiting for us to leave with a night deposit. So the police rolls up and he's driving out and almost flips his truck over by driving sideways off the hill and goes to the gas station. They arrest him for felony possessions, felony impersonation, and 4 and 3 drug possessions, etc. Pretty creepy. I seriously wonder what his intentions were with us in the store. When I was growing up, I'd be walking down the hallway and feel something touching my shoulder. I'd turn around and nothing was there. One time I was playing A Link to the Past and saw this shadowy head peek around the corner. I freaked out. My mum was in the kitchen, the room where the shadowy head came from, and said nothing was there. My dad would read bedtime stories to me, and we would hear knocking. I always thought it was him doing the knocking. I knocked on the bedframe a few times to mess with him, but remember hearing the knocking as well, and he swears it wasn't him. We moved out a few years and moved back in. My first or second night, I woke up to see the bright lights right outside the house. It looked like the moon, but it was far too bright. I also remember it being right outside the house, not behind things like the moon should be. This one could be a dream, but I specifically remember my parents mentioned the fact that I woke them up in the middle of the night to tell them about this random thing that happened. It doesn't necessarily mean it was a dream. We sold the house and moved out. I remember laying across in my bed from my parents' room as we downsized one morning, and I was trying to get back to sleep. I had woken up to take a leak, but my parents were up and talking, and I heard my dad saying about how he was pretty sure the house we used to live in was haunted. Oh, and the house I grew up in burnt down. The lady who bought it had kids, and one of the kids burnt it to the ground.
My family was on vacation in Florida, I think near Orlando. I was 16 at the time. We had just settled into our hotel room, and we were hungry. So my parents went out to get pizza. I was really tired, so I decided to stay in the room. A little while later, I hear knocking at the door. So I get up and go to open it, assuming that it was my parents with the food. But I decide to try and look through the peephole first, just to be sure. That's when I saw there were two guys with their faces covered, attempting to open the door. I backed up and can hear them twisting the knob and pushing. So I freaked out and screamed, "Get out! We're calling the cops!" I grabbed the hotel phone and started calling the lobby, telling them what was happening, and I heard whoever they were start running down the hall. Staff showed up, but they didn't find whoever they were, at least not to my knowledge. My parents showed up a little while later and talked to the staff and all that, but I was pretty shaken, and it was definitely not a fun way to start summer break.
This happened when I was at university. There was a society dedicated to mountain hiking, and I signed myself up straight away. It had always been a passion of mine. My father used to take me hiking from a young age. We had a transceiver radio in our club room. We would check it regularly to see if people were doing okay on their hikes. One of the club members piped up and said, "Hey guys, I'm pretty sure I'm getting an SOS transmission here. What do I do?" We all headed to the radio and gathered around. It was there that we heard the undeniable sound of Morse code being transmitted. The sound of dots and dashes over the crackly radio line. "That's SOS without a doubt," one of the senior members confirmed. Then he set about repositioning the antenna to determine the location of the transmission. The signal was coming from the Joetsu border, and we got permission to use the society's owned car and headed off in the direction of said signal. We didn't have enough information on the situation to call the police, or even know where they were necessarily at that point. We decided we would call them once we had checked out the situation ourselves. Others opted to join us in their own personal vehicles too, and it took about 3 hours to coordinate the location of the signal. It was coming from a forest area beneath Mount Tanegawa. We parked the car in the parking lot at the visitor's entrance. There were only a few cars parked there as it was a weeknight. We all had a handheld radio with us to help pinpoint the exact location of the signal. We checked it periodically to make sure we were heading in the right direction. The radio started going crazy. It seemed like it was howling at one point. It usually didn't do this, so everyone was surprised. Following the leader of the group, we entered a mountain trail. It was night, and the dense tree coverage made everything dark, but we quickly found a rucksack. We searched for a while longer and discovered a body. It was too late. We got out of the area and made contact with the police. We were all understandably shaken up by this. I mean, we were only university students. We didn't want to leave the forest though. We needed to explain it to the police. None of us noticed until much later, but the radio stopped emitting the SOS signal, and of course, no one doubted that the poor soul who perished in the forest trail was the one who raised the signal. Think about it though. How could a corpse possibly do that? We had this confirmed when the police said that the hiker did not have a radio on his person. What made this even more disturbing for us was the fact that the hiker had died 2 days ago. How did no one find the body in that time on the mountain hiking trail? The police explained all of this in a follow-up meeting with our hiking society. They said that they eventually found a radio, but it was submerged in a nearby stream. So who signaled SOS? The strange thing was that there were a lot of us there, and we didn't see anyone in the area, but that's not to say that someone might have been nearby. Can you imagine someone in the woods and the shadows of it, summoning us to the grisly sight of a murder under the false pretense of an SOS to watch us discover their work? We were there late. We watched all the cars leave that parking lot, and not one was left. That might suggest that someone had taken the body there. This case is still unsolved at this point. Who the hell raised that signal? We talk about that strange night in autumn on most of our society meetings. I am a female who was 23 when this occurred back in 2016. I was moving from New York City to Boston. 2 college friends, also female, agreed to live with me, and we started looking for an apartment. We were fond of one place in particular, out in the suburbs next to a forest park. I got talking with the landlord, an older man probably in his 70s, and mentioned that I repair antique dolls. He excitedly said he had a doll his mother's uncle had brought her back from Germany in World War I, and the elastic holding on the arms had worn out. I said I could definitely fix it, and we exchanged contact info. He was firm that my work would have to take place at his house since he was nervous about moving a fragile antique, but at the time I didn't think anything of it. Now that I'm older and wiser, I know doll doctor house calls are not the norm. Ultimately, we went with another place closer to the city proper, but I didn't want to lose a prospective doll repair client, and I called him a week or so after we got settled, and once again he seemed delighted to get his family heirloom fixed. Nothing seemed odd until I asked for his address to work out how to get there. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll pick you up. What's your new address?" My eagerness cooled a bit. I tried to put him off by saying that I didn't want to bring him out of his way, and I could get myself there no problem, but he kept insisting. Never even told me which town he lived in, just repeated over and over that it was fine, he'd pick me up, and that it would be no trouble at all. Eager for the business, and a bit embarrassed about my paranoia, I caved. I told him my address, and we arranged a date and time for him to pick me up. Over the next few days, literally everyone in my life told me to call and cancel. My housemates asked me if I'd lost my mind. My mum and sister both told me I was driving them mad with worry, and to be honest, I think I was looking for an excuse to call the whole thing off. It just didn't feel right. I called the evening before the appointed day, and left a message saying that something had come up. I added that if he was free the following Monday, my housemate could drive me over, so he wouldn't be inconvenienced, which was true. She offered in a last-ditch effort to make me see sense. The next day, the time we'd picked rolled around, and I was sitting in the living room working on a sewing project, when a car pulled up in front of the house. I looked down, and my heart jumped when I recognized the old man sitting in the driver's seat. He didn't look up, and didn't appear to see me, and just sat there for what felt like a century until finally he started the car and drove off. I never saw him again, and he never contacted me about getting his mother's precious doll repaired. And maybe I was overreacting to an innocent old guy with poor social skills who forgot to call back, but I had a bad feeling about the situation, and ultimately think I did the right thing. The part that creeps me out the most is I almost had this man for my landlord. It could have been fine, or it could have been much, much worse. I worked in an airspace museum in my late teens and early 20s. Huge echoey building full of wartime planes and spacecrafts and tons of history. It was a pretty cool place. I heard a ton of spooky stuff, whether you were alone or in a group. I was closing up one night after a catering ordeal, and while I was mopping I felt something behind me and I heard a "Pardon me?" in a man's voice. I stepped to the side, and when no one passed me I turned around to see if he actually just needed something, but there was no one there. Later that same night I went to clock out, and as I passed under a balcony I was hit with one of those big black binder clips that you use to hold a stack of documents together. I look up, totally dark. Understandable, it was close to 2 in the morning. I continued walking and got hit with another binder clip. I sped walked away and heard a third clip hit the ground behind me. When I got out, the auto alarm set, meaning I was the last worker in the building, and I got out of there real quick. Never told anyone, though I'm sure they would have all believed me. That place is known for paranormal activity, especially now. When I was little, My parents divorced, and I went to live with my dad, as he was moving to a new town. We ended up buying this big house out in the country, outside a little podunk town. This house was huge for the two of us, but it was right on a little pond with an island, so it was cool. There were other houses around, but it was basically surrounded by cornfields, which scared the hell out of me because of the movie Children of the Corn, which had just come out, and it still terrifies me to this day. Anyway, freaky stuff started happening almost immediately after we moved in. On Halloween, my dad and I brought this huge pumpkin, carved it, and put it in the front window. We went out of town one night, and when we came back, it was smashed in the middle of the living room, 10 feet from where it was sitting. I didn't think much of it because my dad played it off, but I then heard him on the phone with his new girlfriend later that night, saying how freaky it was. He moved on pretty quick after Mum, straight player. Weird and random noises happened pretty much every night, and we just grew used to it. Even voices started, but my dad always told me it was the house settling. I have never heard a house say the name Jeffrey, even when it settles. That was when I would always hear someone calling out. But then there are 2 messed up instances that happened that first scared us into selling the place. Even years later, my dad still talks about how it freaked him out. The first was the night when we had a really bad storm. I was 10 or so. My dad was done letting me crawl into bed with him anymore, so I had to brave that on my own. It was about 3 in the morning, and this storm had been raging for a few hours. We hear this loud boom from the first floor. Both of our rooms were on the second, and then we hear glass shattering. My dad yells at me to stay upstairs, and he goes down to investigate. He came back up 20 minutes later and tells me to go to sleep. Turns out our bay windows had been blown out during the storm. The freaky thing was all the glass was outside the house, not in shards in the room. He got it fixed the next day and never mentioned it again. The second was when we had to pull down the attic that was in the hallway between my bedroom and the bathroom. One night I woke up to go to the bathroom, and as I was walking down the hall I ran into the hanging attic door. My dad was sound asleep in his room, so it freaked me out. However, as I was walking back to my room after my piss, I ran into that door again. I heard some rustling going up on in there, and figured it was my dad, so walked past it towards his room, but he was in there snoring. I freaked out and told my dad. He got up, turned on his bedroom light, all angry at me. We both looked into the hall, and even though the hallway light was off, we could tell the attic was now closed. My dad was pissed, told me to go to bed and turned off the light. To this day, I still turn on every damn light upstairs of my current house when I have to pee, much to the dismay of my wife. We moved soon later, and I have never gone back to that place. About a year ago, my family and I were visiting with my dad and stepmom. She was actually the girlfriend from the original story, and we got to talking about the house and how it tormented me. My stepmom said she stopped going over there because of all the weird haunting stuff. My dad said he never told me growing up because he knew it would scare me, but he knew the house was haunted. He said the house used to be in town, but when the widow who lived there finally died, the new owners decided to move it out to the country on the land by the pond. He said the day they moved in just happened to be the old lady's funeral. He said they purposefully drove the house by the graveyard as they were having the cemetery, and stopped and opened the front door to let her spirit back in. That's messed up. Anyway, the new owners didn't stay there long, and my dad bought the house shortly thereafter. And that explained a lot as to why so many strange things kept happening.
I'm now going to share with you a story that happened a few years back, in a hostel room in a not-so-great part of London. I happened to be awake at the night. The rooms are a bit stuffy, and I was considering opening a window. It was dark, but there is some light entering the room from a nearby streetlight, so I'm not sure if my eyes are playing tricks on me. But there's this guy on the other side of the room. I know I've seen him because he stops moving as I realize he's there. I'm getting concerned now. This is London, and not to make vast assumptions, but it's quite possible he has a knife. I shuffle along my bed slightly and he edges closer. I have to move now, and I think I may need to make it to the nearest door. I stand and make my way towards him, heart pumping for a fight. A couple of steps in, I get this feeling that this isn't right and I'm missing something. My eyes adjust a little more. I take half a step more and my eyes focus a little more, and then bam. I realize I'm not staring at another guy. I'm staring at myself. What I thought was someone else was just my reflection in a full-length mirror that was filthy near the door. I literally almost perished at the thought of my own reflection.
The following happened when I was a child. My parents and I went on a camping trip with some family friends. There was a big lake by the campsite. It was a very peaceful and secluded area. So we all put up our tents near the river and were set to camp for 2 days. When night came, my friends were talking about doing some dares. The adults overheard us and told us not to do any dares at night as it could be dangerous. Of course, we all ignored our parents' advice. The dare was to walk around the lake by yourself with no flashlight. One of my friends offered to go first. We all waited in silence as she walked off into the darkness. She came back after a while. She wasn't frightened in the slightest. Next was my turn. They urged me forward. I was nervous, and I felt the pressure of my friends. I had to do it. It was so dark. I was getting really worried. I was walking around the lake, only the sounds of nature could be heard. That is until I heard the footsteps approaching towards me. I prepared myself as best I could for whoever was coming towards me. It looked like it was one of my parents' friends. He was working with a flashlight. I knew him. I was relieved. I waved at him as he approached. He strolled towards me. He handed me something. It was a lemon candy. I thanked him. "You should eat that now," he said in a hushed voice. I told him I would eat it later and put the candy in my pocket. He was shining the torch at me. I couldn't see his face clearly. He had his hood up. "Come with me," he said, but it didn't sound normal. I said I had to go back to the tent. I thought it was weird, but he was a really nice guy, and I was enjoying the camping trip with his family and mine. When we got back to the tent, we all decided to get some sleep. I was laying in bed thinking of the candy, and that I should just thank him for it tomorrow, while I held it in my hand. In the morning, I walked over to him while he was drinking coffee and thanked him for the candy. "Lemon candy? What are you talking about? I didn't give you any candy," he said. I thought he was just teasing me, trying to trick me. After a while, I could tell he wasn't joking. He said he wasn't at the lake that night. My mum came out of the tent, who had happened to hear our conversation. It got weirder and weirder. I went back to my tent to get the lemon candy to show them. All the parents and my friends looked concerned and frightened. Who was the person I met at the lake? I threw that piece of candy into the lake as our family picked things up, and we got out of there as fast as we could. I'm a short, medium-sized girl. One day around a year ago, I was pregnant and made a trip out to Target to buy some things. I'm a very cautious person and constantly looking at my surroundings with mild paranoia, mostly inherited from my mum, who raised 3 kids on her own. She was always on her guard. I got out of the car, which I parked a little far away from the store entrance, for 2 reasons. I didn't want to get any dents from other drivers, and I tried to get as much exercise as I could since I was pregnant. As I'm walking, I notice a huge red truck with 3 men inside with the windows down. I assumed they were waiting for someone inside the store, but something creeped up my neck when I made eye contact with the driver. I quickly turned away and immediately began to feel self-conscious. A small girl, visibly pregnant, and I suddenly felt so vulnerable. Up until that point, my pregnancy was smooth and had never made me feel like a target. Once I finally got in the store, I felt more relaxed and went about my shopping. When I left the store and noticed the truck was still there, I put my bag in the trunk and got in the car and quickly turned it on and drove away. I noticed in my rearview mirror, the truck was also taking off with only the same 3 men inside. My heart sank. I realized they weren't waiting for anyone inside the store. I got in the lane that can only be a left turn, and they were on a lane that can only go straight a few cars behind me. I thought, great, we're not going in the same direction, and I was just being paranoid. As I passed the light turning, I see the red truck switch the lane I was in to turn left. I sped up to catch with the next light turning yellow to put as much distance between me and them. I drove a little faster than usual and realized even if I made it home they could still follow me there and I would be going back to an empty home. So instead I drove past my street to a shopping center that had a Starbucks. The drive-through wraps around the building so you aren't visible to the main road I was driving in. I'm getting into the drive-through and notice the red truck going on the road I just left. They drive past the Starbucks and I think, good. As I'm still in the drive-through, I see the truck pass by again in the opposite direction, almost as if they were looking for me. I wait in the drive-through for the other cars to leave at this time, and I call my sister and tell her that I'm heading to her place, as I didn't want to go home alone and my boyfriend wouldn't be home for several hours. As I'm driving to my sister's house, which is about 25 minutes away, my mind just begins to wander. What would have happened if they'd have caught me? Had these men been following me from before? Any danger that could have happened to me or my baby made me so paranoid that I didn't leave my house for the remainder of my pregnancy. I was shaking by the time I got to my sister's and told her all the details I could remember. To the creepy man in that red truck, I've never seen you since, but please, let's not meet. I worked night shifts for 3 different jobs, but my most eventful was at the hotel. To start off, it was definitely haunted, and I had 3 big separate incidents that happened to me involving the paranormal, which I'm going to get into now. So, the first one was only a week into the job. This was a small 2-story hotel with hallways inside. I decided to do a round just to make sure things were okay and check things out. Things were quiet as it was around 2 a.m. I reached the upstairs hallway and just strolled quietly along when I heard faint footsteps behind me. I turned, saw no one, and continued on my way. I kept hearing footsteps as I would walk, so I just started glancing over my shoulder but kept moving. I didn't see a soul, so I started speed walking. This is when the footsteps started turning into shuffling sounds, like someone was dragging their feet on the carpet at a fast rate. I didn't turn around that time but started jogging. The shuffling got louder, closer and quicker. At this point I was terrified, and I reached the downstairs lobby at a full run. That's when I heard a loud and rapid breathing/snorting directly in my ear, along with the feeling of hot breath on my ear, like someone was out of breath, but exaggerating their gasps. I ran behind the front desk and ducked down in a crouch, covering my ears, and had my eyes squeezed shut. It felt like someone was standing directly over me. Then I could feel my hair being lightly brushed, like a light breeze went through it. I was sobbing. I stayed like that for a good 10 minutes, too scared to open my eyes. When I finally did get up from the floor, I went to the back room for the rest of the night until the manager came that morning. Risking being thought as a complete whack job, I explained what happened. That's when she told me that the guy before me quit because he almost had the exact same experience. In the 5 years I worked there, I never went to the upstairs hallway at night again. I would also often see dark shadows down the downstairs hallway, moving along the walls and going around the corner. Once when I saw the shadow, it started moving away from me and turned back toward me, and I ran back for the night. The last incident I had was when I saw a guy, clear as day, standing in the pool area after hours on the security camera. The doors were supposed to be locked, so I got annoyed thinking a guest had ignored the pool hours and managed to get into the area. I had already cleaned up the area and restocked the towels, so I marched out there to kick this guy out. I went through the door, and the area was dark. No ripples in the water, nobody in the sauna. The one bathroom door was wide open and empty. There was no one there. I came through the only door in the area and nobody passed me on my way out. So I noped out of there and hid in the back room for the rest of the night. This was a town that boasted to be the most haunted town in the state. So, you know. And just as a side note, I don't have any drugs or mental illnesses. These are not just ghost stories. They really happened to me. And each incident scared the crap out of me. The place is called Atchison, Kansas. It's located along the Missouri River. Atchison was a famous aviator, and Amelia Earhart's birthplace and host of an annual Amelia Earhart Festival during July. Along with being one of the most historical cities in Kansas, it's also noted, as I said, as the state's most haunted town, drawing paranormal enthusiasts from all around. I lasted at this hotel for about 5 years. There was also one incident where I had to have a K-9 unit guard the lobby because a woman escaped her abusive husband and he was out looking for her with a gun. He had a shootout with the police and was on the run, and they put her up in the hotel for safety. So as you can imagine, that was very fun. About a year ago, I moved into an apartment complex that was fairly new. So it can't be haunted because it's not old, right? First few weeks I stayed there, I didn't have any issues. But about the month after I started living there, I began waking up in the middle of the night, around 1 or 2 a.m. to a man standing in my hallway. He wore a white t-shirt and jeans and looked like he was probably in his 30s. When I saw him standing in the hallway, I would bolt out of bed yelling, "What the hell are you doing here?" But by the time I reached it, he would be gone. And because I was a bit stressed at the time, I didn't think anything of it. Having grown up in a haunted house for real, I was accustomed to strange things happening, but I had never seen a full-bodied apparition with a face and clothes in such detail, so I figured it wasn't an apparition. I figured I must have been dreaming, and was probably one of those stress-induced dreams where I didn't recognize that I was dreaming. This happened 3 or 4 times over a 2-week period. In general though, even when I didn't see a man standing in the hallway, I would still wake up at around the same time every night. At the end of this 2-week period, I was pretty tired. Then after the 2-week period it stopped. I stopped walking in the middle of the night and didn't see any random dudes in the hallway. I went to a friend's house for Sunday dinner at this point, tired, but other than that, all was normal. I'm really close to my friend's family and her parents are basically my parents, and I go to her parents for advice when I need it. Normally I'm the one to pull them aside when I'm struggling, but this time her dad pulled me aside and asked if I was alright. I said I was fine, but stressed, and other than that life was good. He had a pretty intense look of concern on his face, so I was a little taken aback by the intensity of the "Are you okay?" question, so I asked why. This part is a bit religious. Sorry for the non-religious ones out there, only a small part of the story though. My friend's dad is a pretty spiritual/religious person, and when I asked why, he said that the other night he'd had the strongest feeling he needed to pray for me, and pray that my home be cleansed, that the evil presence in my home would leave. So about the time he prayed, that evil presence left my home. I started sleeping through the night, which brings me to the next part of the story. In the apartment above me, there lived a crazy person. Well, maybe she wasn't crazy, but it kind of seemed like she was. An older woman in her 60s. I would hear her pacing the floor and talking all night long, not every night, but a lot. At first I thought she was watching TV, but then I realized it was a single voice, never background music. And when she would talk in the bathroom, I could hear her conversations. Gotta love them walls and apartment living, am I right? I should mention she lived alone. And when she would have these conversations, there was never any other voice, just her. So I assumed she spoke to herself all night long. Fast forward 6 months, when the lady upstairs moved out, her family actually came and moved her out suddenly. Finally, I would be able to sleep without hearing her talk to herself all night. By this time I had a roommate, and my roommate had a dog. A few days after the lady upstairs moved out, the dog stopped going into my roommate's room and would freak out in the hallway if you left her there at night. I now sleep with my door closed, because I had a roommate and her dog, so I didn't witness the freakouts at first. Normally during the day, the dog would sit in the window of my roommate's room and watch the people go by basically all day long. Now suddenly she wouldn't go into my roommate's room, and when she was in the hallway she would cry and scratch on my door to be let in. At night she would normally sleep in my roommate's room, but suddenly she wouldn't, and if you forced her you would literally have to drag her in, and then she would scratch and cry to leave. I started to feel like I was being watched when I showered, or would feel like someone else was in the room when no one was. That's when I noticed the man in the hallway was back. I never told my roommate about my previous experiences with the man in the hallway, until she brought up that she started feeling weird at night, and would wake up night after night. If you don't want roommates to pick up and leave, you don't tell them ghost stories have happened in your house. So that's when I told her about the man in the hallway, and when we called my friend's dad. My friend's dad came over, blessed the house, and we didn't have any issues after that. The dog went back to hanging out by the window all day. A few days after the guy in the hallway stopped showing up, my roommate started sleeping through the night again. My theory is the man in the hallway left my place and went upstairs, and that's who the lady upstairs was speaking to all night long, and why her family freaked out and moved her suddenly. Once she left, he came back down to mine, till he got booted. The question is, where did he go?
This happened about a year ago. I work at an upscale hotel in one of my state's most affluent suburbs. Like most hotels, we struggled badly during the coronavirus outbreak. Our rates had been slashed in half to get guests through the doors, and our clientele had shifted from upper-crusty business people to a mixed bag of characters. It's mostly been fine, with a couple of notable exceptions earlier on in the pandemic. Cut to the night I was working. I work alone overnight, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. About 3 hours into my shift, I get a call from room 235. He has a strange voice. It's quiet, raspy, and perhaps a hint of an accent. He tells me he can't figure out how to work the remote in his room. I assume that the batteries could have died, but he insists the remote works fine. He just doesn't understand how to operate the volume button. I find this strange. I've worked in hotels for 5 years, and I've never once encountered someone who didn't understand the TV remote. I give him the benefit of the doubt. The volume button is like the Guitar Hero strum switch. You have to press a single switch up or down to navigate. Also, working in customer service, you do come to realize that people are much, much dumber than you want to believe they are. Since I'm alone at the hotel and technically not supposed to leave the front desk, I tell him that if he comes down to the lobby, I will gladly show him how it works. This upsets him, and he grunts and starts complaining that our customer service is terrible, and what kind of hotel wouldn't have an attendant come to the room for something like this? I give in. He's only 1 floor up, and I can't possibly take very long to show someone how to change the volume on a remote. Everyone has checked in. It's not worth the argument or the bad review later, and I tell him I'll be up in just a moment. I knock on his door and do the customary call-out. Guest services. I can faintly hear him talking to someone, but it's muttered, and I can't pick out any distinguishable words. At first it felt like he was instructing someone else to get the door, and I anticipated it opening shortly after. The talking went on for so long that I wondered if maybe the people in the room hadn't heard me. I was debating knocking again when the deadbolt slowly unlatched. Normally when I go into a room, the guest opens the door wide and stands to the side to let me in, or at the very least opens the door enough so that I can fully see them, and they can fully see me. Not 235. He barely cracks the door. It's open maybe an inch. Even weirder, all the room lights are off. It's entirely dark except for the very faint glow of his TV, which is on but with the volume turned all the way down. His voice sounds exactly like it had on the phone, raspy and whispered. He's standing behind the door so I can't see him at all. Completely disembodied, he instructs me, "Come on, come inside, sweetie." I say nothing and don't move. I guess now is the part where I tell you I'm a smallish 5-foot woman with a baby face in my mid-20s. "Come on, come inside." He sounds more edgy, more insistent this time. It felt so obvious like a trap that if I wasn't absurdly on edge, I would have been insulted. How naive does he think I am? I push the door open but remain as much in the hallway as possible. I take the opportunity to reach for the light switch just inside the door. The room lights up, and I finally get a look at him. He is at least 60, white-haired and slim, but with a little gut. He's shirtless, is wearing pants, but his belt is undone, and the ends are flopping down. I'm not entirely sure, because I try not to look, but I believe his pants are also unzipped. He appears to be completely alone in the room. The only piece of luggage is a small black duffel bag. I try to explain the volume switch from where I'm standing awkwardly in the doorway, but he isn't comprehending at all. Or at least he's acting like he isn't. I ask him to give the remote to me so that I could show him, but he backs further into the room. "You know, it'd be easier for both of us if you just come inside." For a brief moment, I think I see his eyes glimmer. I made it through the night. My boss was very concerned and felt badly and apologized if he had ever made me feel like I had to go up to the guest rooms, while alone, at the property, and made it clear he wants us to never do that again. For the record, no one has made me feel like I have to do it. All of the front desk staff do it from time to time. I usually don't unless it's one of our regulars who just needs a new roll of toilet paper or something. I did in this instance because it seemed like it would be quick, and while he sounded weird on the phone and I hated his voice, I didn't expect it to go as it did. You encounter a lot of weird people working in lodging. Usually I feel like I can tell the benign from the malignant. Obviously it was a bad call on my part and I was wrong in this case and I learned my lesson. As for not calling the police or my boss right then and there, I felt like I was potentially going to be in harm's way while I was standing in the doorway and he was actively being a creep. But when I got downstairs to my lockable office with my security cameras, which would have allowed me to see him coming, I was just really anxious and on high alert. I had decided that if he called again, I obviously wasn't going up, and if he came to the desk I would have 911 punched in my cell just in case. We were 2 minutes from the police station, and there's usually a patrol car hanging around in our shopping centre. They're quick to show up any time I had to call. Also, I'd like to think critically before I call the police for any reason. I've called them on someone for being similarly as weird, but in a slightly different way, and was told that unfortunately he hadn't technically done anything wrong, and to call back if he did. I don't believe it would have gotten me anywhere. I didn't call my general manager because he lives 45 minutes away, and I'm not sure what he could have done. Anyway, thank you all for your concern. I just wanted to share that you need to be careful while working, because you never know how creepy these people can get. You really don't want to get into a bad situation just for work.
This happened when I was in school. It was the summer break. I always loved going to see my cousins during the time off school. My family and I went to visit them, as they only lived in the next city over. I was really looking forward to seeing my cousin. He was a little bit older than me, but he was always up for playing games. Unfortunately, he wasn't always around, so I had to play alone. I didn't mind playing alone since my cousin's house backed onto a forest with a small mountain. It was so great. There was always fun to be had, like looking for bugs, and I decided to go exploring. I really wanted to go to the top of the mountain by myself, so I set my sights on the summit and started marching uphill. But then I noticed a dirt path leading off to the side. I was curious to see what might be there. That's when I noticed there was an abandoned-looking house down there. I immediately thought this would be an awesome place to make a base. My cousin would love it, so I decided to get a bit closer to check it out. I was so excited that I had found it. I crept up close to the exterior of the house and peeked through a broken window to see what was inside. I saw something so weird it will stay with me for the rest of my life. It was all decayed in there, but there was a chair that looked brand new. In front of the chair were these life-size cardboard cutouts of famous people. The way they had been placed made me think someone had deliberately set them up around the chair. There was a baseball player cut out, an anime one, and an actress. The way they were positioned around the chair, it was as if they were in conversation with one another. Looked as if it could have been easy for someone in the chair to be the center of attention. The house was a mess. Broken glass, chipped and damaged walls, but the chair and the cutouts were new. It was kind of off-putting. My gut told me that something was wrong here, so I decided to get back to my cousin's house. My skin went cold, despite the hot summer's day. Something innate had awoken in me, and was telling me to leave immediately. I began to scramble up backwards towards the mountain path, and that's when I noticed something in the house. I had gotten up the dirt road a bit, and I had a more aerial view of the cardboard cutouts in the house, and one of them stood out to me. It was moving, by itself. For some reason I didn't run. It was fascinated, and I stood there watching it, cold sweat amassing my brow, unsure what exactly I was witnessing. I looked closer. My heart paused for a moment, when I realized that there was a man hiding behind the cutout. I could see his arms and legs, but not his face. As soon as I figured it was a man, I ran as fast as I could back to my cousin's house, because I was young, and I didn't understand what had happened, or if I would be in trouble. So I decided to keep this incident to myself. If I hadn't noticed the man in there, or my gut instinct was off that day, I might not be alive to tell this story. Who knows? I was so close to walking in there. Now that I am older, I've had time to think about how strange the situation was. What was the purpose of the cutouts? Were they there to lure people? Did the man tell naive people or children that they could meet celebrities if they followed him into the house in the woods? And then, what would he have done to them? I still think about this from time to time. My wife always tells me I need to make a book about the creepy things I've encountered. I co-owned a local delivery service. There was a woman called Sue who constantly did odd things upon delivery. She was in mid-50s, grey hair, and solid moustache for a woman, and creepy as hell. She progressively got worse. It started with little odd things. She would say, "Have you ever tried beef? It's delicious." And come to the door with her face covered in grease and say, "It's a new face treatment." One of my favorites was me miscounting change at the end of a long day. I realized my mistake and went to correct it. She matter-of-factly stated, "Laser beams to the back of your head make you stupid," and then slammed the door closed in my face. She once told me, "I once had a party thrown for my many achievements. They turned a basement into a club for me. I go into the basement and there's hundreds of people applauding. When I turn around, Tom Hanks was there, and I said, 'Tommy, you get out of here.'" None of these were provoked or requested conversations, bear in mind. And she just went off and you'd have to stand there and nod along. It kept getting worse. She started tossing piles of garbage outside her townhouse and would drop piles of quarters out of her hand, which would roll into the trash pile and then ask you to pick them up. I told all the drivers to refuse and make her get more money. Then one day, it all hit the fan. As I parked, as there was enough blocking my car that she couldn't see where I parked, I hear her scream, "Who are you?" I knock, tell her the total, and she acts like she has the money, and has her hand closed and drops it in my hand. "Nothing," I chuckle. She points to the ground, clearly dazed, and says, "Money. There was something round on the ground, maybe a rock." I state it's not money, and she goes inside saying her friend will pay me. Confused, I question it, and she walks away with an odd look, saying she will find money or he will pay me. I figure she's odd. Screw it. I'm waiting and waiting, and she's closed her glass door, but not the wooden door, and I open the door and holler, "Sue, I need to get going." There's nothing. I peek in to see if something's wrong, and I decide to open the door and go in. I turn to the right and see a couch with her feet sticking out from behind it. I assume Sue had had a heart attack and hurry towards her. As I approach, I hear her grunt like an animal, but still only see feet. I round the corner cautiously and see Sue on her hands and knees digging into the ground like a dog. She was grunting, and I see white spit foaming from her lips. She turns to face me, and I've run faster than I ever had in my life. I jumped in my car and did 50 out of there. I called the cops to do a wellness check, but never heard anything from it. I checked the papers for her name, nothing. What still weirds me out is that she called twice a day and never called again after that day. Still gives me the creeps. Sue, never call again. We will not go there, and your existence haunts my dreams. I work the night shift in a hotel. One night, just as I was minding my own business, I hear a noise coming from the restaurant. My ears prick up, and I wonder what it could be. The sound was loud, and as it continued, I heard the sound of plates breaking. That was seriously creepy. So I get the security guard, and we go and check it out. When we arrive, we're astounded. There's not a thing out of place. We both stand there flabbergasted, how we both had heard what we had, and yet there was no evidence. The breakfast guy also said he once saw a man in the kitchen at 5 a.m, and as he went to say something to him, he walked straight through the wall. Safe to say the hotel was haunted as hell. On many nights, the smell of food cooking came from the restaurant. I mean big cooking. I don't know what the invisible people were cooking, but it smelled great. Many times I felt like I was living the movie The Shining. There was also one security guard that reported a young man had disappeared on encounter in the parking lot, and another lady reported 2 young phantom men in the same parking lot on another occasion. You can say it was creepy to work there. My home has been haunted since the day I moved in. I'm a Wiccan, and I know this can stir up energies and stuff. So my home, before it was made into flats, has been many things. It has been a theatre, a town hall, a clothing factory, and a nightclub, which burnt down apart from the outer walls, which were then used for the exterior of the flats, one of which I live in. We have had minor disturbances due to spiritual activity. Some activity feels okay, while others are negative. One room in particular feels bad. When my husband moved in, he had always flatly refused to sleep there. So, a few years after meeting my husband, I fell pregnant, which in itself had some odd occurrences. Time moves on, and we needed to prepare the room for the baby. We live in a 2-bedroom flat, so my boy had to sleep in that room, where my husband refuses to sleep. My baby boy is born and seems really happy. There were a few occasions where things happened. Once he was in his high chair and pointed to a point where there was no one and said, "Man, coming." This totally freaked out my husband. Over the years, instead of my boy wanting to spend more time in his room, he has spent less time in it. bedtimes were always a battle, as they are for most parents. But for us it was worse, as he would flatly refuse to sleep in his room, to the point where my husband would have to carry him or bodily walk him down the hallway. So my friend and her daughter came over for the day. The children begged us for a sleepover, to which we reluctantly agreed. The children played all day, but at one point they opened the loft which is in his room. They both said they felt a very cold wind come out of it. We as parents told them not to play with the loft, as it could be dangerous, as most parents probably would say. Dinner time comes. The kids have takeaway and a movie, and the evening moves on uneventfully. So getting near bedtime, we wanted the children in separate beds due to age and being a boy and a girl. So we pulled out the sofa bed so that my friend and her daughter could sleep there. The children had other ideas, and were play fighting on it, and then laying on it watching TV. We told them after time that this cannot happen, and in the end they agreed with my friend sleeping with her daughter, and my boy would sleep on the other side of the sofa. Time moves on. It's getting later and later, and as kids do want sleepovers, they didn't want to sleep, but eventually did. My friend had brought some wine over, and suggested we go into my boy's room for a few drinks. Not so many we couldn't deal with the kids, but enough to get us giggly. So we sat in my son's bottom bunk with our drinks and some sweets. The mattress was normally nice and soft, but we felt it harden and felt like someone was pushing it from underneath. There was no gap under the bed where anyone could get under. It felt like the mattress was being lifted. My friend screamed. She saw a man in a black suit with a top hat and a cane, which stood at the end of the bed near her. We got off the bed like a shot. We then called upon Archangel Michael, who normally always heard your call, but at night he didn't respond, no matter how hard we called him. My friend checked on the children and they were sleeping, but 5 minutes after she left the room, they rushed in telling us something woke up with them, feeling like they were being choked by a man in a black suit, which is what my friend saw. Not to mention the air in the room felt ice cold and had a bad smell. We ushered the children into the lounge, one adult in front and one behind. They sat on the bed and we told them it would be okay, but it wasn't. My friend tried to call or text a friend. She had no signal and credit, but nothing got through and her phone continued to play up. Anyway, back to the children. The entity followed us back to the kitchen and lounge, where once again it continued to attack the children. The girl said it had its arm down her throat and she could hardly breathe. My son was feeling physically sick and also had trouble breathing. It gave my friend awful stomach pains, and she felt physically sick too. The children drew the sign of the cross on a piece of card which they put on the wall, and shortly after this, the cross looked like it had been swiped off the wall and inverted. We also put frankincense oil on the children's heads, which then made everything go away. We then all stood up and told it to leave. We told my boy he had to stand up to it, and his room to claim his space back, which he did. Since then, my friend has been filling our home with light. I'm getting the house blessed and have put frankincense around the house. My boy, as of yet, has not gone back into his room. I'll sleep there first. But hopefully, whatever it was, is finally gone.
In 2019, me, my boyfriend, my best friend, and her partner stayed at an Airbnb in Sandusky, Ohio for a convention. There were several red flags about the place, but it was much cheaper than the hotel near the convention hall, so we opted to stay there. The first red flag happened when we arrived. The owner greeted us and made a point to tell us that his house was directly next door, as in, if there weren't any trees, he would have been able to see into the window of where we were staying. Okay. So he had a few houses on his property. No big deal, right? Wrong. It only gets worse from here. Per instructions, we were forbidden to go into the basement under any circumstances unless there was a tornado. Being the curious young adults we are, we opened the door anyway and were going to investigate but stopped in our tracks as soon as we saw the direction of the stairs were facing directly towards the owner's home. In the darkness, there was a faint electronic glow. We quickly shut the door and barricaded it with luggage. Again, the owner's home was so close, there could have easily been something connecting his house to this basement. A little weirded out at this point, we went and looked at the rest of the house. It was a nice and spacious place, with a narrow staircase to the second floor, where our bedrooms would be. We selected our rooms and began to unwind after the long drive. In my boyfriend and I's room, there was a single random sprinkler in the middle of the ceiling that looked out of place. We were tired from the trip, so we didn't think much of it then. But looking back now, there's a good chance it was a hidden camera. Things only got weirder from here. We were gone most of the next day at the convention, and when we returned, one of the outside doors that we definitely locked was unlocked and slightly ajar. My friends and I collectively shared a look of panic and closed and locked the door. My best friend's partner suggested that maybe the owner needed to get something out of there while we were gone, and didn't close the door completely on the way out. We made sure all of our things were still there, and then soon forgot about it because we discovered something more pressing. The locks on both the bedroom doors were now ineffective. We told ourselves that they were already like that, and that perhaps we just didn't notice them, but I'm not sure I believed that. On our second to last night, my boyfriend and I were both restless over what had been happening at the Airbnb and the day's activities, so we decided to try and find something to watch on TV to take our minds off it. We were flipping through the channels on the TV when suddenly we came across a Windows 10 lock screen and no computer in sight. I opened the cabinets and looked around trying to find a computer. The dresser the TV was on was too heavy to move, but seeing where the wires were positioned, they could have very well gone through the wall and into the basement. We were too frightened to see the basement for ourselves to confirm or deny our suspicions of surveillance, the owner's interference, and who knows what else. Needless to say, we left as quickly as possible on the last day and didn't look back. What do you guys think? Were we being spied on the whole time? We left a review, but of course, it didn't go anywhere.
This happened when I was in high school. My friends and I were all camping together deep in the forest. We had just finished dinner, and we were cleaning up, joking around, when I heard a huge thud. By the expressions on my friends' faces, I was certain they had heard it as well. It sounded as if something had fallen out by our tent. It was dark, so we grabbed some flashlights and went in search of the source of the thud. There was something big and white laying on the ground. It looked like an animal. We were freaking out. We shone our torches at it from a distance. The more we looked at it, the more it looked like a body, a human body. He seemed to have fair or balding hair, and as we approached, we noticed something was wrong. His limbs were bent at impossible angles. We rushed in, realizing the gravity of the situation, and as soon as we got close enough to have a good look, we knew it wasn't a human, but it was as big as. It was a mannequin. Where the hell did it come from? Did someone throw that at us? We scanned the area with our torches, and no one was around. We didn't even hear footsteps or anything when it happened. We were camping, deep in the forest, and didn't see anyone else for the whole day. One of our friends decided to be a watchman, while the rest of us packed up as fast as we could. We got the hell out of there, leaving that creepy mannequin lying face down in the dirt. This happened to me on New Year's Eve a year ago. I was at this party where a bunch of friends had gathered to just hang out, eat, and celebrate together. Nothing crazy in particular happened during the event itself, but rather when I was on my way home. As I was walking along the sidewalk, I think it must have been about 3 a.m. or something, I saw this middle-aged man coming in my direction. I thought little of it. I just assumed he was merely passing until I noticed that he was starting to slow down as we neared each other. I think he smiled as I walked past him. Not a crazy smile or anything, so I smiled back. Just as I thought that I'd been stupidly suspicious about this man, I heard him call out from behind me, like he was after me. I stopped in my tracks and faced him to see what he wanted, and I saw him walking back towards me, his arms outstretched. As he stopped in front of me, he reached out his hands as if he wanted to shake mine. This was when I began to get a little more apprehensive about the situation. I'm sure he must have noticed how I hesitated before I decided to shake his hand. I don't want to be a suspicious person, but I considered the possibility that he might be concealing a knife in his sleeve, or his coat, or that he may try to mug me, or something worse. I thought about what would happen if I started to run. Would he just shrug and continue on his way, or would he follow? All of these thoughts flashed through my mind until I decided to take his hand. I thought that I could always pull myself free and run the hell away if necessary. He then started asking me stuff about what I'd been doing this New Year's Eve, if I had a good time, things like that. He was shaking my hand all the while, and even though I was still on edge, I started to realize this man didn't pose a threat to me. For politeness' sake, I asked him if he had a good time too. After a short while, he let go, said Happy New Year, and went on down the sidewalk. He was probably under the influence, but he must have been one of those people who become happy when they're drunk. I felt stupid but relieved too, and continued on my way home. In the end, he didn't mean me any harm. Perhaps he was kind of sweet. I'll never forget the indecisiveness and spark of fear that ran through me at the moment that he stretched out his hand to me. Because who really knows what's going to happen when you meet a stranger? It's been 8 months since I started working at the night shift in a hotel. No one told me anything until I started asking because of weird experiences. My shift begins at 10 p.m. and ends at 8 a.m. I honestly love it because it gives me time to dedicate to my hobby since I only need to answer the phone and give out keys. It was rather sooner than later that I started to notice weird things. For example, it's really common to see the lights of the hallway on the second floor turning on and off during the night. Sometimes some doors will get open or closed without anyone near them. At the end of the hallway of the first floor, sometimes you can see a shadow person at the end, and you can also hear someone say your name in a really low tone or hear people talking at all hours of the night. I'm the only worker in at night, and most people that come here come for work, so they get to bed really early. The most extreme experience was a day when a girl from the morning shift got here, and we were talking on the kitchen about that day's schedule. Without any warning, every cooking pot and cutting board, dozens of them in different sizes, just flew around the kitchen. Most of my co-workers say that they would not work here at night because they're scared of ghosts. But honestly, I'm so used to these things that I just go and clean the mess made during the night. I've had a lot of other experiences in other places as well, dealing with the paranormal. I moved into my current apartment almost 2 years ago. I knew that something was here from the moment I walked through the door, but it didn't feel malevolent or anything like that. I've always been able to feel their presence, whether they be good or not. The first couple of nights after we moved in, I would sit on my bed and read or colour or just do something to ease my thoughts. I had just moved from a really bad apartment complex, and it was hard for me to sleep at night for sheer paranoid thoughts because bad things would always happen in the complex I had moved away from. The apartment I had moved into was a nice, quiet neighbourhood that was so small and rural. It was a big change, and very nice to be honest. I sat on my bed usually looking down and would see shadows starting across my doorway out in the hall. I would look up, assuming it was one of my daughters either going to the bathroom or needing something. but when I would look up, neither one would be there, and I had never heard any footsteps when I saw the shadows darting across the doorway. Also, at random times, I would hear footsteps upstairs. I know this could be the house settling, but it didn't sound like the house settling at all. I also have a sunroom that branches off my room, and during the summer I kept the door open with all the windows open in the sunroom to keep the air flowing to keep it cooler in my room. I'd also hear footsteps in the sunroom too, and it would sound like things were shifting around a little, but nothing would ever be there when I would check, and nothing would ever be moved either. It is really easy to hear my sister-in-law and her family walking around on the other side, but not like the steps I'd hear in the sunroom. After about a week of this happening, I was sitting awake in my chair in front of my computer, staring off into space. I was tired because even though this was happening, I had been sleeping better because I felt safer. When my husband came home, he asked me what was wrong. I told him, "You'll think I'm crazy, but I keep seeing shadows darting in the hall." I don't know if he believed me, but he didn't really say anything after I said that, and I went to bed. Something else that used to happen was that the smoke alarms would go off at random times. The one on the doorway going into the kitchen was battery operated, and the one in my room and my daughter's room were one of the ones that were supposed to last 10 years, and if you deactivated them, you couldn't use them again. So for a couple of months, one or the other would go off for no reason. It happened multiple times a day, and I was running around like crazy. I finally got annoyed enough and popped the battery out of the one in the doorway going to the kitchen and left the battery out for a while. It continued to go off the one in my room, as well as the one in my daughter's room. Now these alarms are supposed to let you know when their lifespan is coming to an end, but when it goes off, it will literally say low battery in a voice as the alarm is going off. But it didn't. All it said was, "Fire," as the alarm was going off. I had thought maybe the lifespan of these smoke detectors were at an end, so I disabled the one in my daughter's room and looked at the date. It still had 3 years left. All that was left was the one in my room. The smoke detector in my room was still going off randomly, and I was exhausted and going crazy with the beeping of the alarm going off 3 or 4 times a day, and I had no clue how to fix it. I finally just got tired and yelled out, "Will you stop messing with the damn smoke alarms?" And it instantly stopped, and has never happened again. Since then I have replaced the smoke detector that goes in my daughter's room and the battery to the one above the doorway going into the kitchen. Even though I don't feel like whatever is here is evil, there are certainly parts of my basement that I do not like. I don't know how to explain it, but it just doesn't feel right. I told my husband about my feeling, and he told me that it was probably just the light casting weird shadows, because it was cut weirdly. But I have not felt that anywhere else in the basement. Maybe it's whatever's here's personal space, and I'm more than willing to give it to it. Maybe my husband is right. I don't know. The one time I was going to get my dog from upstairs because he needed to go out, and refused to come down because we had people over, and he's very skittish of people who do not live in the house. I was looking up the stairs, and I was going up them. The bathroom light was on upstairs, and when I got halfway up the stairs, the bathroom light shuts off. I really didn't think much of it, and just shrugged it off. I've always told my husband about the happenings of the ghostly, as I call it. My husband is always skeptical. So on one of our game nights, me and his nephew would start talking about our experiences here and other places we've lived. I pointed a finger at my husband and said that he would never believe me. My husband then replied, "No, it's not that I don't believe in those kind of things, but there is probably a more practical reason than ghosts and spirits." I asked him about the incident with the smoke detectors. By the way, it never happened when he was home, and he told me that it was probably a coincidence, but he didn't know. I didn't believe much in just simple coincidences. More recently at night, I wake up to the sound of rustling, like someone is going through the things in my room. The first time it happened, my dog growled low, and I just rolled over and went back to sleep. I've had a few other instances where I woke up in the middle of the night to the rustling, and my dog doesn't growl anymore. I just continue to roll over and go back to sleep. I still see random shadows out of my peripherals, but I'm used to it, so it doesn't bother me. My dog will also stare randomly at corners and growl. I just ignore it, as whatever he is seeing isn't bad, and has never done anything bad to me or my family. So as far as I see it, it can stay as long as it likes. I was working night shift in a hospital that had been operating since the 1800s. It's a large manor house and is a specialist hospital for patients with brain injuries, spinal injuries and physical disabilities. It's a rather large building but has less than 30 patients at the moment due to COVID, so the entire ground floor is empty. During night shift, the nursing staff are allowed to go into one of the hospital bedrooms downstairs on break to rest, and that is what I did yesterday evening. It was around 1:30 and no one else was on the ground floor when I heard 3 knocks on the door in a row. I did immediately feel uneasy. The older staff tell stories about the house. It was exorcised or something 20 years ago, apparently due to strange things happening during the renovation of the hospital, and was said to be unhappy spirits of a matron who had not passed on, but the paranormal activity stopped as soon as the hospital was blessed. Generally, the house is not known for a lot of spiritual activity, maybe the odd door slamming and figures seen reported. I'm used to hearing ghost scary stories while at work in the hospital, but have never experienced anything myself. I went to investigate at the door, but nothing was there when I sat down. It happened again, 3 knocks in a row, and then I said to myself, if it happens again, I'm going to go back upstairs to the ward where I was working on. It did, and I got the most awful feeling of dread and returned upstairs. The other nurse just laughed, but it did freak me out. I googled 3 knocks in a row and was terrified, because apparently it's the 3 knocks of death. I wondered if anyone here knew something about it that I should know. This happened about 5 or 6 years ago. My grandfather lives in a mountainous area of the Miyazaki prefecture. I used to visit him every summer vacation. It was really great. I loved playing in the river by his house, going fishing amongst other things. The summer in question, I had been in the river swimming for about an hour. I started to get cold, so I got out and sat on one of the jutting cliff rocks above the river. I loved it because it was like my own private river, where we never usually had people around. But on that day, I took notice of 2 children about 200 meters away. Even though they were quite far, I was sure that they were elementary school kids like me. I didn't know that there was a school in the area. The only school I knew about was now in ruins. I didn't know about any other kids my age in the area either. It wasn't exactly well populated. They disappeared off in another direction, and I thought I'd better get going soon, as my parents would be looking for me. I was drying myself off and changing back into my clothes when I noticed something nailed to a nearby tree. It was a laminated photo with some text below it. The photo was of a woman and 2 children on either side of her, who appeared to be their mother. Below the photo was only 1 line of text: I am looking for these children. I was a bit put off. I felt a bit creeped out by the poster in the mountainous woods. The strangest thing about the poster was the fact that the mother's face had been scribbled over with a black magic marker. The children's faces had been circled in a red marker. Why would the mother's face be blacked out? Surely she would want to be identified if she was the one looking for the children. Something didn't sit right with me about that poster. Weirder still, one of the kids in the poster had a unique hairstyle which made him recognizable, and one of the kids that I saw by the lake today had the same hairstyle. Close cropped shaven hair. Things were weird, and I wanted to leave the area. So I jogged back to my grandfather's house and asked him about the weird poster. He didn't know anything about any missing kids. Strange. The village he lives in is small and close-knit, so the fact that he didn't hear anything about missing kids was certainly surprising. Something seemed wrong. Later in the year, my family went to visit my grandfather again to ring in the new year. He was having a drink and the poster came up in conversation. He said he found something similar to the poster. I was interested but a bit creeped out remembering it. He passed a piece of paper to me. I wondered why he saved it. I was quite curious now. It was the same poster as last time, except this time there was something written over the photo. The word "found" in bright red ink. I was really creeped out by this. I took it to the local temple and the priest said a prayer, just in case. I have no idea if this poster is an innocent thing or something far more sinister. All I know is the kids looked like they were hiding, and there is something dark about the situation. Who puts up a poster in the middle of the woods looking for children without asking the locals and blacking out their mother's picture? Who did they think would see the poster in the woods? Was their mother looking for them? Was it someone else? Were they kids of some cult escapees? I think about this from time to time. I think there might be something going on at that mountain. I was a night shift CNA at a newly developed nursing home. I had worked at other nursing homes before and expected a few paranormal activities, but with this being a new building I thought we would be good. However, this building had been built on top of the soil from an old nursing home that had been around for decades and demolished to make way for this new facility. Everything was fine at first. For a few months we had a few residents, but as the numbers increased and different halls started to fill, things began getting spooky at night. I've always been somewhat of a magnet for spiritual things, and also my shift partner was a paranormal investigator in her spare time, so needless to say I should have expected this. Anyway, we encountered the usual little things like hearing doors slam in vacant rooms or chairs moving at the nurse's station in the middle of the night. I could handle that stuff, but our experiences started getting too close for my taste. One night I was at the nurse's desk alone at around 3 a.m. when a female voice screamed, "Help me!" right behind my ear. I jumped and turned, expecting to see a resident behind me, but there was no one there. An hour later, a resident down the hall, directly behind me, paged me and said there was a woman screaming for help in her room and wanted to make sure I found her. Residents' pagers would also go on and off, and we would check the room only to find that they were asleep. One time a poor resident started freaking out and said, "Get me the hell out of this room, someone was shaking my bed." All of these things happened at night, and the day shift CNAs simply don't believe us. I was waiting for a hostel in southern France to open, when an old man starts talking to me. I enthusiastically chat, trying to practice my French. In the span of 30 seconds he starts asking what kind of underwear I'm wearing. Then he starts asking if I'd like to touch myself with him. Then he tries to take off my shirt. I'm a guy, by the way, and I yell at him and run away. Ladies, I now understand what you have to go through. The hostel opens and I try to explain in my best French that there's a pervert hanging around here. When I realized I didn't know the adequate French words to express what was going on, I try my best using hand signals, but the woman at the hostel was furious, obviously not understanding, and she began yelling at me, and I just didn't know what she was saying. She didn't want to give me a room, but a boy working there who spoke some English managed to better convince her to rent me a bed. Embarrassed, tired, and disgusted, I went to shower. The showers were outside the dorm, no one was around, so I just went in my small travel towel and took my toiletries. After a freezing shower, I walked back to my room to discover that I had forgotten my key and been locked out. No one is around and I'm just wearing a towel. Finally, I realize I have no choice but to go to the front desk and ask for a key. I go downstairs in my towel and no one's there.
Desperate, I just go outside in a tiny towel and look for anyone. The entire staff is in the dining room with an entire Swiss marching band. Fortunately, the angry French lady is near the door, and I gesture for her to come over. She immediately starts yelling at me, drawing the attention of the 100+ people to a guy in a towel. Merde. I try to explain that I forgot my key. She keeps yelling. She must think I'm some kind of crazy perverse dude trying to flash everyone. She finally gives me the key, and I end up getting very drunk with the Swiss that night.
Every year my family gets together with friends to stay up until midnight on New Year's Eve and have a party. When we do, we usually shoot fireworks and burn our Christmas trees as a normal celebration of the new year. We live far out in the country, and bonfires are normal. Across the street, under the streetlight, there is this camp of sorts where people work. We set off our fireworks around midnight, and there's this guy standing under the streetlight, silhouetted, and he's glaring at us. He was just across the street, but far enough away that we couldn't see his face, along with it being pitch black save for the light of the bonfire. I point it out, and it freaks us out a bit, but we try laughing it off. After a while longer of shooting fireworks, we look back and he's still standing there. He wasn't there for a long time, just standing under the streetlight, and it creeped us out. Me and the other kids would joke around and yell at him to mind his own business, but he stayed there and didn't stop staring at us. I remember him either laughing or whistling or something. We did it back for humor, but it was quite creepy. He was there for literally hours. Later on, we'd pretty much forgotten all about him, and looking back, he was gone. I don't know who he was or why he did that. This was a few years back. The street lighting he was under is still there today, and I have that very sinister memory. I wonder why he was there, watching us, for so long. I'm a 23-year-old male from the UK, and like everyone, I have a story to tell, and this one is 100% true. But first, allow me to put things into some context. At the time of the events in this story, I was 13. In fact, I had only turned 13 weeks prior to the following event. This happened to be my hometown, a small coastal town on the southwest coast of England, a place where I no longer live. I moved not because of the memory of these events, but because of work and my love life. On the night these events began, my group of neighborhood friends and I gathered, like we always did, to play a game called Manhunt. It's a bit like hide and seek, but when the manhunter catches you, you join his or her team. There are two other types of ways to play this game. There's flashlight manhunt, where the manhunters use flashlights to catch you, and if they keep you in the flashlight beam long enough to count to 5, you're on their team. And then there's torture manhunt. This one, you would catch hold of one of the hiders and beat them a little until they gave in. Thankfully, none of us ever went that far. The worst I've ever got was a kick to the balls, and the worst the girls in our group ever got was a light bear hug. The torture for them was being hugged by us guys, as we had for the most part all grown up together, so they give in because of the awkwardness more than anything. We played 2 games of Manhunt on our housing estate, which is basically the UK's government version of government-provided housing for families on low income, all lumped together on land that is useless for anything else. We played these games from around 6:30 in the evening to 7:45. We all sat in the estate park after these games. It was pitch black at the time in the evening, and this was the middle of November, it getting dark early. We were all of varying ages. The oldest of the group who lived next door to me was 15 years old, Joey. Joey had heard on the news that there was supposed to be a meteor shower that would be clearly visible in the sky later on that night, between the hours of 10:30 and 2 in the morning. He suggested that we go and watch it. We all danced around the idea for a while, and then one of the girls, Amy, decided to jump up and suggested to ask our parents if we could all go as a group. None of us were sure if our parents would let us go, and figured it wasn't worth asking. But she pointed out that Joey and the oldest girl of the group, Lexi, who was 14, both had cell phones, and both of them had all our parents' numbers from when we all hung out together, and our parents needed to get a hold of us. This was back in 2008. Not all kids had cell phones back then like they do now, and even if they did, they were lucky to have anything that resembled the cell phone of today. After Amy said that, we all jumped up and began to run home to our parents, begging to be allowed to stay out and watch the meteor shower. It was a Friday night, so there was no school the next day. Joey and Lexi stayed in the park and called their parents from there. I walked with my then boyfriend Callum. I'm bisexual and have known for some time at this point. He was 13 and had only been 13 for a short period of time, as he had his birthday 2 weeks after mine. We'd started dating each other 3 months after he and his family had moved, 6 months before these events. He'd asked me out. He was thin, had a mop of shaggy black hair with pale skin, and was shorter than me, with brown eyes your heart could get lost in. I was only 13 and never had a boyfriend. I had one girlfriend, but that didn't last, nor did we get serious, so of course I said yes. He too was bisexual, but he didn't want to tell people about us, as he felt it would be weird for both of us to like girls and each other, and he felt like no one would understand. Believe it or not, things weren't as politically correct back then, nor were people as accepting. There was still a lot of homophobia around, in our town at least, and especially in our high school. We walked slowly down the hill to our street from the park, just talking about what we had done in our English class at school that day. When we rounded the corner to begin walking down the street, Callum stopped and grabbed my hand. I was confused. It was the first piece of affection he had shown for me all night, and it was in a public place, which wasn't like him at all. I looked up at him and saw him staring off up the street ahead of us, just beyond the turning to the street we lived on. In a patch of grass was a street lamp. He was looking at the street light. "Can you see him?" he asked, his voice trembling a little. "What?" I said, and looked at the street light. And he was right. Just beyond the glow of the light cast by the street light, a man was standing in the shadows. He just stood there, not facing us at first, but he must have become aware that we were staring at him, as in the light we saw him turn to face us. I could feel his eyes on me, looking right at me. I felt like they were looking into my very soul, and Callum's grip on my hand grew tighter. I then noticed the orange/red circle where his mouth would have been. He stepped forward into the light, blowing a cloud of smoke from his mouth. He didn't say anything, but carried on staring. "Do you think he knows Jake?" Callum asked me. Jake was a guy who lived in the house that the guy was stood next to. Jake was in college, and it was common knowledge that he was a pot dealer, and one with no morals. He even tried to sell it to me and Callum once. He seemed to be one of the only 2 people on our estate who guessed we were a couple, as he called us lovebirds when he tried to get us to buy pot from him. Jake was a strange guy, but was harmless enough. He was pretty much a hippie. I don't know. I said to Callum, "Maybe?" Although this guy under the streetlight didn't look like the type of person Jake would hang out with. This guy wore a dark, full-body tracksuit and a baseball cap. The guy stuffed out his cigarette against the metal post of the streetlight, chucked it to the floor, and walked towards Jake's house, disappearing behind the hedge that led to his backyard. I heard a sigh of relief from Callum. "I'm so glad you were with me then," he said, squeezing my hand. "Let's go," I say. "Yeah," he replied. Although we weren't telling anyone about our relationship and not being affectionate in public, we walked down our street holding each other's hands, only stopping when he let go to walk into his house and I to mine. We didn't think to tell anyone about the creepy guy with the cigarette. All of our parents said that we could go watch the meteor shower, so long as no one drank any alcohol. But of course, when you tell kids that age not to do something, it's a sure bet they are gonna do what they were told not to. We all met up at the park after getting confirmation from our parents and decided to go to the top of the hill, called Duckett's Hill, as it was a well-known landmark. Not for any special reason, it just had a very good view of the marshland that surrounds it. We walked to Duckett's Hill and settled on the top. Joey and a friend of ours called Tyler started a bonfire as it was cold, and it was a chance to have a real kids-only get-together. Amy and her older sister Faye had taken 4 bottles of some cheap, nasty wine from their parents' wine cooler and decided that we all needed to drink some. I decided not to, because I felt like someone needed to keep an eye on the fire with a sober eye, and I had this horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that the creepy cigarette guy could turn up and start watching us. As we waited for the time to go by, we all sat around the fire Joey had built up, passing the wine bottles from one person to the next, all of us taking a sip each time except for me. I passed it on to Callum, who sat unusually close to me in front of our friends. He was so close, he could rest his head against my shoulder, and if the wind was in the right direction, I could smell him, a mix of Lynx Africa deodorant and the cherry-scented clothes detergent his mothers used to wash their clothes. It's a smell I'll never forget. Somehow we got onto the subject of who in the group would make a good couple. This left me and Callum a little uncomfortable, as you can imagine. We'd been secretly dating for 3.5 months, and we'd only made it to third base. And our relationship was, as all relationships are at that age, pretty fragile. Amy, who was 12 and the youngest of the group, Tyler, Faye, Callum and me were all 13, pointed at me and said, "So who would you date out of the girls here?" I look around at everyone sheepishly. "I dunno," I said, shrugging. Everyone groaning in disappointment, even Callum did. I later found out he was genuinely interested in who I would be dating in our group, if not him. Before I could show my nervousness, I blurted out, "I mean, you're all pretty hot. It would be hard to choose." This was a lie. They were all pretty hot, but I'd thought about asking Faye out a month before Callum moved in across the street from me. She was almost 14 and was a very hot emo chick. All of us in that group were skateboarding emo types, although me and Callum were the only guys who didn't have the typical emo hairstyle. Mine was just dead straight and shoulder-length hair. His, as I mentioned, was long but shaggy. He still had a way to go before it got to my length. I had had a crush on her, but when I tried to ask her I got too nervous and bottled out, mainly because I couldn't get her alone to ask her. Amy was hanging out with us at the time, and I had to hype myself into asking her again, but by the time that happened, Callum had moved in, and my world changed forever. Everyone groaned at my answer, even Callum, who made a joke about me wanting to date all of the girls in the group and being a man whore. I can't remember what he said exactly, but I know he put an arm around my shoulder and pulled me close so he could screw up my hair. "You know," Lexi said, "you and Callum would make a cute couple," and then added, "We could use a gay couple to bring some sassiness to the group." Callum sheepishly laughed and said, "Yeah, good one," before gently pushing me back to how I was sitting before he grabbed me. I stoked the fire and stood up. I needed to pee, so I walked away from the fire to the crest of the hilltop. I didn't go far in total darkness. I stood close enough to the fire, and they could still see me, but far enough away to have privacy. I started staring at the hill as I relieved myself, when I noticed something I had seen earlier. A circular orange-red glow from the lighted tip of a cigarette. My urine flow stopped mid-pee. The man from the street lamp was back. He was at a distance away, but close enough that all I could see of him was the tip of his lit cigarette. His eyes were on me again. I could feel them bearing into me. A light emerged where the guy's hands would have been. It was like a small flashlight. He whirled the letters C, U in the air, and then it switched off. The cigarette fell to the floor, and I could just about hear the sound of him making his way through the tall, knee-height meadow grass as he walked away down the other side of the hill. Once he was gone, I carried on my business. From behind me, I heard Joey call out to stop touching myself, which of course made everyone laugh, even me, although it was nervous laughter. I returned to the circle around the fire, not knowing whether I should warn the others or not. I looked at Callum's side on. I just took him in for a moment. His button nose, his eyes, his noticeable but not too prominent cheekbones. He had a pretty face for a boy, although it was clear he would grow up to be a handsome and chiseled young man. He seemed to be relaxed and happy, so I decided not to ruin it and keep what I saw to myself, a decision I would later come to regret. We carried on talking for a while. After 2 of the 4 bottles of wine had been drunk, someone, I can't remember who, suggested that we roll down the hill in the dark. Everyone has rolled down a hill as a kid, and for some reason in everyone's tipsy state, doing it in the dark was an amusing prospect. Joey decided to stay at the fire to keep an eye on it, letting the rest of us roll down the hill. Callum had never consumed alcohol to this level before, and was a lightweight. It had gone to his head a bit too quickly. He wasn't massively drunk, but he couldn't quite walk without staggering a little, and he didn't want to roll alone. So he grabbed a hold of me, pushed me down to the ground, straddled me, and we rolled down the hill. It was a weird moment for me. I knew the creepy cigarette guy was out there, but in the arms of the boy I loved, so there was a sense of joy there too. When we got to the bottom of the hill and stopped rolling, he didn't get up right away. He kissed me. I kissed him back, but before we could make out or anything, we heard heavy footsteps behind us, moving amongst the grass. We both shot up and ran up the hill, neither of us saying anything to each other. The 3rd bottle of wine came out and passed between us all again. This time I took my one and only sip for the night. Callum took a few gulps. I leaned in and told him not to drink any more, because he wouldn't be able to hold his drink. He nodded and stopped. As it turned out, my warning about him drinking came too late. He was swaying and staggering hard as he walked when we left later. I kept my eyes peeled for Cigarette Guy, but cannot recall seeing him again while we were there. The clouds in the sky hadn't cleared, and the meteors should have been flying over us. It was 11:30, and we decided it was too cold and we were all too tired, and that it was best that we went home. We put the fire out, switched the flashlights on, and walked along the path that we had used to get to the hilltop, back to the road. For some reason, as we stepped onto the sidewalk, Callum decides that he wants to go to our estate's local store, which was open until midnight on Friday and Saturday nights. He wanted to grab something to eat. I tried to get the others to come with us, but they wouldn't. I have no idea why. It was known in the group that me and Callum were close, but I always assumed that the others didn't know how close. I could have been wrong. But even today, I still think that Lex had a suspicion about mine and Callum's relationship. I thought it back then too. She just seemed to drop hints here and there that she knew what we were keeping to ourselves. This was reinforced to me that night as her parting words for us were, "Boys have fun, just play safe," which made us laugh, of course. To get to the local store from where we were, we left the group and we had to walk down a hill that was normally full of traffic during the day, but at this time of night it was as quiet as a back-end country road. We walked slowly on the sidewalk, my arm around Callum's waist. I was holding him up, and we were alone now, and he would have staggered into the road otherwise. When we reached the bottom of the hill, he had to stop. He said his head was spinning. He leapt forward into the road, his hands clasped around his knees, and began to retch and throw up. "I told you wouldn't be able to handle your liquor," I said. He half turned and flipped the bird at me. I laughed. I looked up at the top of the hill to see if anyone was there, and there wasn't. Callum threw up once more and stood up, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. I was looking up at the top of the hill when he grabbed my arm and started pulling me along the sidewalk. "What's up?" I asked him. "Look behind you," he said. It was the creepy cigarette guy from earlier. He was stood under two large oak trees that stood at the entrance to the small side street that had about 8 houses on it across the road, where Callum had thrown up. The field where the fire was, right next to this little street. "Hey boys," the man said, in an accent that gave away where he was from. I grabbed a hold of Callum, picking him up practically, and started running. As I said earlier, he was shorter than me and a lot lighter in weight. I had to put him down as we reached the store though. He got heavy after a short time, but we kept on running. We didn't have to run before we reached our housing estate. We had to pass the estate next to ours, and then we would be at the end of the road leading into the one that our streets belonged to. We kept darting, looking over our shoulders behind us, and the cigarette guy was jogging after us at a leisurely pace, as if to keep a safe distance, almost like he was toying with us. Once we reached the road that led onto the estate, Callum started freaking out. He wasn't hysterical, but had tears running down his face. "I'm scared," he told me. I always thought I would be a cool-headed and cocky type of person in these situations, but I wasn't, and I had to admit that I was scared too. I'd never been so scared, nor have I been. "Me too," I replied. We reached the turn into our streets, and like idiots, we stopped to catch our breath. I think Callum wanted to stop crying before we went to his house. I was staying there that night. We had become friends the day he moved in, and it was like my second home. Sometimes I spent more time there than at my house with my mum and 2 sisters. I was over there so much, I even had my own toothbrush, bath towel, and 2 changes of clothes. I hugged Callum to try and keep him calm. There was no one around, and frankly at that point I didn't care if anyone found us hugging. I was just glad to be alive and away from cigarette guy. I looked down to the entrance to our estate, and the cigarette guy was there again. So we ran across the grass verge that went along the top of our street and down to Callum's house. The house was all in darkness. His mum has not stayed up with us. We knew this was a possibility, but we hadn't expected it. Callum was struggling to get his keys from the pocket of his skinny jeans. That's a bit of a horror movie cliche, I know, but it's the truth. I looked up to the entrance of our street and he was there. Cigarette guy was just standing there. It was so cold, you could see the breath steaming from his mouth. I shook Callum and told him to look. The guy raised a hand and waved a slow camp wave with his finger. Callum looked at the keys and found the right one, opened the front door as quietly as possible, and we crept inside, locked it behind us, and went upstairs. We went to the bathroom to relieve ourselves and brush our teeth. Callum cleaned himself up a little bit. He had a bit of puke on his chin. Then we went into Callum's room. We got undressed into our underwear and into the separate beds. Callum had bunk beds. He was on the top, I bottom. We would do this when I slept over in case his mum or sister came into the bedroom, so they wouldn't catch us in the same bed. After they had been in bed for an hour though, I would climb up the ladder and get into bed with Callum. We spent the next 20 minutes talking about Cigarette Guy and what he could have wanted from us. I couldn't think of a single reason he would have for wanting to talk to 2 13-year-old boys in a small coastal town in that area of the UK. Using kids as drug runners is as rare as unicorns, so non-existent. "I don't want to be by myself, babe," Callum said. I climbed down the ladder and got into bed with him. We talked for a while longer and tried to take our minds off creepy cigarette guy. At around 6:30, Callum woke me up, shaking me violently. I looked at him as if to say, "What the hell?" But he wasn't looking at me. He was pointing at his bedroom window. He looked terrified. I looked to where he was pointing, but the blind was down. And on top of that, the curtains were drawn too, so I was confused. You couldn't see anything on the outside. "Listen," he whispered to me. There was a slow but soft, methodical knocking on the windows. It was soft enough to not wake up the whole house, but loud enough for us to hear. Callum's window was directly above the front door, and below the window was a porch with a roof-like shelter. His mum had put a strong trellis for a creeper plant to grow on each side. The trellis was strong enough to support the weight of a fully grown man, if he were to climb it. Callum wanted to call the police, but I said no. I was getting foolish now. I thought I could deal with this. I stood up and walked over to the window. I went to one side and peeked around the blind. I could see the creepy cigarette guy out there on the roof of the shelter. He looked at me through the gap in the blind and waved that girly wave again. He then plastered a piece of paper through the glass of the window, folded up, and placed it under a stone on the outside windowsill. He put a finger across his neck like a knife cutting someone's throat, climbed back down from the shelter, and I pulled up the blinds and watched him walk away up the street into the darkness of the early morning. Once he was gone, I opened the window and grabbed the piece of paper. I unfolded it, and there was a message scrawled in terrible handwriting which read, "Watch your backs, you little craps. I know where you live." I showed the note to Callum. He begged me to tell his mum and call the police, and I told him we needed to relax and think about how to proceed very carefully. It could be a mistake, I told him. He may have mistaken us for someone else who didn't pay him or something like that. Really? Somehow I highly doubt it. Who would mistake us for the Cray twins? Callum said. Honestly, he did have a sassy side that would come out in intense situations. We folded up the letter and hid it under the black rug Callum had on the floor. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands and then came back to bed. We slept through until 10 a.m. and decided not to tell anyone. We wanted to see if the guy would show up again, and we agreed that if he didn't, then we'd have nothing to say. We never saw him again. We asked Jake, the pot dealer who his friend in the baseball cap and tracksuit was, and Jake said he didn't know anyone dressed like that, or anyone from Liverpool. After that, we said nothing more to no one. Callum and I stayed together for another year and a half before we decided to mutually end things. We both had met other people we liked. I have now married the girl I dated after me and Callum split, and we have a child together, and I'm working as an English teacher at high school level. Callum went on to date another guy for 3 years. As far as I know, he is now settled down with a woman he met while backpacking around Spain. I'll always remember what happened that night. I haven't thought about it consciously for years, except for yesterday, as I was standing at the gates of high school, the one I teach at. Me, along with 3 other staff members, have to supervise the kids as they leave school to get onto school buses and into their parents' cars, etc. As I stood at the gates doing this, I saw a man in a dark full-body tracksuit wearing a baseball cap smoking a cigarette, and the memory of the whole night came flooding back in detail. I wrote it down to share this experience with others anonymously. Keep your eyes peeled, folks, because anyone can be dangerous. Cigarette smoking man, let's never meet again.